I stood in the center of the elite Buckhead Country Club, wearing the MBA gown I had sacrificed 5 years of sleep for, while 350 guests raised their champagne glasses. But they were not toasting me. My mother stood at the microphone smiling at my younger sister and announced to the room that she was the only child who had ever truly made her proud. My father nodded in eager agreement. Nobody noticed when I quietly set down my glass and walked out the door. But they definitely noticed when the police arrived an hour later. Before I share my story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to cut off toxic family members to protect your peace. My name is Gabrielle, and I am 35 years old. The crystal chandeliers of the Atlanta Country Club sparkled above the crowd of politicians and megachurch pastors. I had paid $20,000 out of my own pocket to rent this ballroom. It was supposed to be my night, a celebration of the Master of Business Administration degree I had just earned. I had worked grueling 80-hour weeks at my venture capital firm to fund my own education, proving that the Spelman dropout could finally cross the finish line. But in my family, my achievements were merely an opening act for my younger sister, Brielle. At 28, Brielle was the undisputed golden child. She had always been paraded around as the flawless, brilliant daughter. Tonight was no different. My mother Beatrice tapped her crystal glass with a silver spoon, commanding the attention of the massive room. I adjusted my gown, preparing a modest smile for what I assumed would be a brief acknowledgement of my degree. Instead, my mother turned her back to me completely. She looked directly at Brielle, who was wearing a custom designer gown that cost more than my first car. "Ladies and gentlemen," my mother projected into the microphone, her voice dripping with Southern charm. "While we are gathered here, I want to take a moment to celebrate the true star of the Vance family. My beautiful Brielle has just been named a junior partner at a prestigious law firm. I wish it was you holding that diploma tonight. You are the only child who has ever truly made me proud." A wave of awkward murmurs rolled through the room, but they were quickly drowned out by my father Calvin clapping loudly and shouting his approval. I stood completely frozen. The humiliation burned in my chest, hot and suffocating. I had spent my entire adult life trying to earn a fraction of the pride my parents freely showered on Brielle. I thought this degree would finally prove my worth. Before I could process the public rejection, I felt a heavy hand clap onto my shoulder. It was Preston, Brielle's husband. He was a white man from a supposedly old money family in Boston, and he never missed an opportunity to remind everyone in Atlanta of his pedigree. He leaned in close, his cologne overpowering, and gave me a condescending smirk. "Do not feel bad," Gabby Preston said, his voice loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. "Taking until 35 to get a degree is still cute. It shows persistence. We cannot all be natural-born prodigies like my wife." My father, standing close by, let out a booming laugh. "That is right, Preston. Brielle just has that natural gift. Some people are born leaders, and some people just take a little longer to catch up." For 15 years, I had swallowed my pride. I had smiled through the passive-aggressive comments at Sunday dinners. I had watched them funnel all their resources into Brielle while treating me like an afterthought. I remembered the day I left Spelman College because my parents claimed they were out of money. I spent years thinking it was my fault, only to discover later they had forged my signature on a massive student loan. They took $100,000 of debt in my name to pay for Brielle and Preston's destination wedding in Cabo. They ruined my credit, stalled my education, and treated me like a burden. And now they were using the very party I paid for to elevate the sister they had stolen my future for. I looked at Preston's smug face, then at my mother, who was currently posing for photos with Brielle. I did not cry. I did not scream. The girl who used to beg for their love had died years ago, replaced by a woman who managed multi-million-dollar corporate acquisitions. I calmly reached into my designer clutch and pulled out my phone. I opened my banking application and navigated to the pending transactions. Right at the top was the $20,000 authorization for the country club's premium catering and open bar. With a single tap, I canceled the payment. I then texted the event manager, informing him that the hosts of the party, Beatrice and Calvin Vance, would be providing a new payment method for the evening. I slipped my phone back into my purse, set my water on a passing tray, and turned toward the exit. I walked out of the ballroom in complete silence, leaving my family to bask in their fabricated glory. The humid Atlanta night air felt incredibly refreshing as I handed my valet ticket to the attendant. He pulled my sleek black Maybach around to the front. My family thought I was a struggling mid-level employee, completely unaware of the holding company I had built from the ground up. Just as I settled into the plush leather seat and started the engine, my phone vibrated violently. It was a text from my mother. "Get back here right now. The club manager just shut down the open bar and is threatening to call the police over the bill. Stop embarrassing us and pay for this immediately." I smiled, the engine purring softly beneath me. I typed my reply with steady fingers. I know Preston can use his generational wealth to cover it. Oh wait, the manager told me all 4 of his credit cards declined. Have a wonderful night, Mom. I put the car in drive and pulled away, knowing the real storm was only just beginning. The scent of candied yams usually brought comfort, but today it felt like a trap. I walked into my parents' formal dining room straight from the morning service at our megachurch in downtown Atlanta. The southern heat was sweltering, but the air conditioning blew ice cold. My mother, Beatrice, still wore her elaborate lavender church hat, acting as if she had not sent 30 frantic text messages the night before. She passed a platter of fried chicken to Preston, who sat at the head of the table, a seat reserved for my father. Calvin, my father, sat quietly to the side, nursing a glass of sweet tea. Brielle checked her reflection in her phone screen, adjusting the diamond tennis bracelet she flaunted during service. I took the only empty seat left, at the very end of the long mahogany table. Nobody asked how my drive was. The silence was thick and deliberate. Beatrice finally set the heavy ceramic platter down with a sharp thud that echoed in the high-ceilinged room. She folded her manicured hands and stared at me from across the table. Her eyes were cold and calculating, entirely devoid of any maternal warmth. "I hope you reflected on your childish stunt last night, Gabrielle," my mother said, her voice deceptively calm. "The country club manager called us this morning. He gave us until tomorrow to clear the $20,000 balance, but his patience is thin. You are going to fix this. You are 35 years old and single. The least you can do is be useful to the people who actually tolerate you." I poured a glass of water. "I'm not fixing anything," I replied softly. "I canceled the check because you chose to celebrate Brielle's fake achievements at a party I paid for. The bill is yours now." Preston scoffed, wiping his mouth with a linen napkin. "Do not be ridiculous, Gabby," he said, talking down to me like I was a stubborn toddler. "We all know you do not have 20 grand lying around anyway. You maxed out your little credit cards to rent the room." Beatrice leaned forward, her lavender hat tilting slightly. "Listen to your brother-in-law," she instructed. "I spoke with a friend at the bank after service today. They can approve you for a high-interest personal loan by tomorrow morning. You will sign the paperwork, take the funds, and pay the club. It is the least you can do to save this family from humiliation in front of the congregation." I looked at my mother in pure disbelief. "You want me to take out a high-interest loan to cover a party you hijacked?" I asked, my voice steady, despite the rage building in my chest. Calvin slammed his glass down, splashing sweet tea onto the white tablecloth. "You owe us, Gabrielle," he shouted, his voice booming with the false authority he used when leading the church choir. "You have owed us for 15 years. Do you think we forgot how we had to remortgage this very house to pay for your tuition at Spelman College? We drained our savings for you and you threw it all away just to drop out and embarrass us. We gave you the world and you spit in our faces. You owe this family your life." I sat perfectly still, letting his words hang in the air. For years they had used that exact story to keep me submissive. Every time I tried to speak up, every time I tried to set a boundary, they would bring up the second mortgage they supposedly took out for my education. It was the heavy chain they wrapped around my neck to keep me bowing to Brielle and Preston. But I was not the naive 20-year-old girl anymore. I was a senior director at a venture capital firm, and I handled corporate investigations for a living. I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out a thick manila folder, placing it next to my empty dinner plate. That is a fascinating story, Dad, I said, keeping my tone completely conversational. Especially since I was on a full academic scholarship at Spelman until I had to leave. I opened the folder and slid a stack of banking documents down the polished wood table toward him. The ink on the original promissory note from 15 years ago clearly showed a crude imitation of my handwriting. I decided to do a little digging into that second mortgage you always talk about. It turns out you did not remortgage this house for my tuition. You forged my signature and took out a $100,000 private student loan in my name. The color instantly drained from my father's face. Beatrice gasped, clutching the pearl necklace at her throat. Preston stopped chewing his chicken entirely. I kept my eyes locked on my father. "You stole my identity!" I continued, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You forged my name on federal documents and took out $100,000. And you did not use a single dime of it for my education. You used it to pay for Braille and Preston's lavish destination wedding in Cabo. You ruined my credit score for a decade so your golden child could have ice sculptures and a private beach reception." Brielle slammed her hands on the table, rattling the silverware. She glared at me with pure venom. "So what if they did?" She screamed, her voice shrill and unrepentant. "You were dropping out anyway to be a nobody. We needed the money for the wedding to maintain our social standing. We are family and family helps family. You should be grateful we even let you sit at this table." I smiled and pulled a heavy black legal binder from my bag, dropping it onto the table with a deafening crash. "Family," I repeated softly. "That is a funny word. You see, yesterday my venture capital firm purchased the specific collection agency that has been holding that exact defaulted loan for the past decade. I own your debt now, and as the new owner I am calling it in. You have 48 hours to pay me $100,000 plus 15 years of interest in full, or I am legally seizing this entire house from you right now." The room fell completely silent after my ultimatum. The heavy wood table seemed to stretch for miles. My father stared at the binder like it was an explosive. Brielle was frozen stiff. It was Preston who broke the silence. He let out an arrogant laugh and stepped forward. He adjusted his expensive suit and walked toward me. He tried to intimidate me, stopping inches away. He looked down at me with a condescending smirk. "You really think you can come in here and threaten us, Gabrielle?" he asked, his voice dripping with misplaced confidence. "You are playing a very dangerous game. You might have made lucky moves with your startup, but you are out of your league. My family has retained the most elite lawyers in Boston for generations. We have attorneys who specialize in crushing nuisance lawsuits. If you do not drop this threat, I will make sure my lawyers bury you in litigation for the rest of your miserable life. We will take whatever money you think you have." I looked him in the eye and let a slow smile spread across my face. I raised my hand and snapped my fingers twice. My bodyguard Marcus stepped into the room. Marcus handed me a small silver flash drive before stepping back. I held the drive up so it caught the light from the chandelier. "You are right about one thing, Preston," I said, keeping my voice perfectly calm. "Your family in Boston does have excellent lawyers. In fact, I spoke with your father and his legal team just last week." The color began to drain from Preston's face. His arrogant smirk faltered slightly. I tossed the flash drive onto the dining table right next to the binder. "You see, Calvin and Beatrice," I said, turning to my parents, who were still recovering from the shock of my foreclosure threat. "Your son-in-law has been telling you a very compelling story. He plays the part of the wealthy trust fund heir perfectly. The suits, the car, the country club memberships. But it is all a carefully constructed lie. Preston is not a trust fund baby. He was completely disowned by his family 5 years ago after he embezzled from his own father's company. He is a disgraced scammer with absolutely no access to the generational wealth he constantly brags about." Brielle let out a sharp gasp. "That is a lie," she shouted, stepping toward me. "You are just jealous because I married into an important family, and you are alone. Preston comes from old money. Old money does not bounce 4 credit cards at a graduation party, Brielle." I replied without breaking eye contact with Preston. "He has been broke since before you met him, but that is not even the best part. I turned my attention back to my father, whose face was turning a dangerous shade of red. "Tell me, Calvin, how is the megachurch building fund doing lately?" I asked innocently. "The congregation has been raising money for 3 years to build that new youth center. You put Preston in charge of managing the accounts because of his extensive financial background." My father swallowed hard, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "The fund is doing very well," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "Preston has been making strategic investments to grow the principal amount." I laughed, a cold, harsh sound that echoed in the quiet room. "Strategic investments is certainly one way to describe it," I said. I pulled my tablet from my tote bag and unlocked the screen. "Preston has a massive gambling addiction. He owes dangerous people a lot of money. Over the last 18 months, he has systematically drained $600,000 from the church building fund to cover his losses at underground casinos." The dining room erupted. Brielle started screaming that I was insane. My father demanded to see proof while simultaneously defending his decision to trust Preston. Preston stood completely still, looking like a trapped animal calculating his next move. But it was my mother who surprised me the most. Beatrice stood up and slammed her hand on the table to silence everyone. "You stop this right now, Gabrielle," my mother demanded, her voice trembling with desperation. "You are trying to tear this family apart with your vicious lies. Preston explained everything to us last month. He told us he was temporarily moving some funds around to secure a higher yield return. He is investing the church money for a better return, so we can build an even bigger youth center. You do not understand high-level finance, so you are trying to make it look like a crime." I stared at the woman who had birthed me, amazed by her endless capacity for denial. She was so desperate to protect the image of her perfect son-in-law that she was willing to justify the theft of congregation donations. "Investing it for a better return," I repeated slowly. I tapped the screen of my tablet, connecting it to the large smart television mounted on the dining room wall. The screen flickered and then mirrored my display for everyone to see. "Let us look at that high-level finance right now." I opened a secure banking document on my tablet. The television screen illuminated the room with rows of financial data. "This is the primary offshore account where Preston has been transferring the church funds," I explained, highlighting a specific line item. "But he did not put it into mutual funds or bonds. The account is registered to a property in Miami, Florida." Brielle moved closer to the television, her eyes scanning the document. "Miami?" she asked, her voice dropping to a confused whisper. "Preston does not own property in Miami. He does not own it," I clarified. "But his wife does." The room went dead silent again. Brielle turned slowly to look at Preston, who was now sweating profusely. I scrolled down to the next document on the screen. It was a marriage certificate dated 4 years ago, along with recent photographs. The pictures showed Preston on a sunny beach, smiling and holding a toddler next to a beautiful blonde woman. "He invested your church money, all right," I said, my voice ringing with absolute finality. "He invested it directly into an offshore account belonging to his secret second wife in Miami." The image of Preston's secret Miami family burned brightly on the large television screen, illuminating the dining room in a harsh fluorescent glow. For exactly 5 seconds, the entire house was consumed by a suffocating silence. Nobody moved, and nobody breathed. The only sound was the low hum of the air conditioning unit and the heavy ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the hallway. I watched as the reality of the offshore bank accounts and the second wife slowly processed in Brielle's mind. Her perfectly contoured face drained of all color, turning an ashen gray before flushing into a violent mottled red. She slowly turned her head to look at Preston, who was now pressing himself back into his dining chair as if hoping the expensive floral wallpaper would swallow him whole. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some pathetic excuse or a web of lies, but no sound came out. The golden boy of Boston, the supposed financial genius who had been lecturing me about high-level finance just minutes ago, was reduced to a sweating, trembling coward. But my sister did not direct her fury at the man who had stolen her identity, drained her father's church fund, and built a secret life in Florida. Instead, her eyes snapped away from Preston and locked onto me with a level of pure, unadulterated hatred that actually took my breath away. In a split second, Brielle let out a blood-curdling scream that echoed off the high ceilings. She planted her hands on the edge of the heavy mahogany table and vaulted herself forward. She lunged across the dining table, kicking over the platter of fried chicken and sending crystal water goblets shattering to the hardwood floor. Sweet tea spilled everywhere, soaking into the pristine white linen tablecloth like a dark stain. Her manicured hands curled into claws, aiming directly for my face. I barely had time to brace myself for the impact, stepping back and raising my arms to block her sudden attack. But the impact from Brielle never came. Before she could cross the final distance, a pair of heavy hands clamped down on my shoulders with bone-crushing force. It was my father. Calvin had rushed around the table with terrifying speed, but he had not moved to restrain the person throwing glass and lunging across the room. He had moved to restrain me. He yanked my arms behind my back, pinning me securely against the heavy wooden credenza, effectively offering me up as a defenseless target for his golden child. "Look what you have done, you vicious little monster!" Calvin roared directly into my ear, his grip tightening painfully on my wrists. "Look at your sister. You have ruined her life just because you are jealous. You are tearing this family apart." I stood there pinned by my own father while Brielle stood inches away, chest heaving, screaming insults at me. The physical sensation of my father's hands restraining me while protecting my attacker was the ultimate manifestation of my entire life in this family. Even when Preston was exposed as a thief and a bigamist, even when Brielle was acting like a violent lunatic, I was still the designated enemy. "Get your hands off me, Calvin," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously calm octave. I did not yell. I did not struggle. I simply spoke with the absolute authority of a woman who held their entire financial future in her hands. The utter lack of fear in my voice must have unsettled him, because his grip loosened just enough for me to forcefully jerk my arms free. I stepped forward, brushing the wrinkles out of my blazer, and locking eyes with Beatrice, who had rushed over to wrap her arms around Preston and Brielle. My mother was actually comforting the man who had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from her husband's congregation. "You are sick," Gabrielle Beatrice cried, holding Brielle tightly against her chest. "You manufactured those documents. You hacked into his accounts and fabricated all of this just to destroy your sister's happiness. You could never stand to see her succeed where you failed." "Get out of this house," Calvin yelled, pointing a shaking finger toward the heavy oak front doors. "You are no daughter of mine. You are banished from this family. You think you can march in here with your little fake startup company and threaten us with foreclosure? We will destroy you. I will use every connection I have in this city to make sure you never work in Atlanta again." I bent down and calmly retrieved my legal binder from the tea-soaked tablecloth. I wiped a stray drop of water from the leather cover, taking my time making them wait in the uncomfortable tension. They were threatening a woman who had the power to render them homeless with a single phone call. The sheer delusion was almost fascinating to witness. Brielle wiped her tear-stained face, pulling away from our mother's embrace. She stood up straight, smoothing down her designer dress and jutting her chin into the air. She was desperately trying to claw back the arrogant superiority she had worn when the dinner began. "You are a joke, Gabby," Brielle sneered, her voice dripping with venom. "You think buying a collection agency makes you powerful. You think you can intimidate us with a defaulted student loan. I just got hired as a junior partner at Vanguard and Associates. They are the most ruthless corporate litigation firm in the Southeast." She took a step toward me, pointing her finger at my chest. "Preston does not even need his Boston lawyers. I will personally handle your case. I will drag you through civil court for harassment, forgery, and defamation. I will bury your little venture capital firm in so much legal paperwork, you will be paying legal fees for the next 20 years. I will personally draft your bankruptcy papers and hand-deliver them to your sad little apartment." I looked at my sister, letting her pathetic boast echo in the silent room. Vanguard and Associates. It was indeed a very prominent corporate law firm in the city. They represented major holdings, real estate developers, and high-net-worth individuals. It was the perfect place for an arrogant, underqualified social climber to hide behind a fancy title. I opened my mouth to respond, but the sharp ringing of my phone cut through the heavy air. I pulled the phone from my pocket and glanced at the caller identification. A wide, genuine smile spread across my face. The timing was so flawless, it felt orchestrated by the universe itself. I held the phone up for Brielle to see, then tapped the screen and put the call on speakerphone at maximum volume. "Good evening, Miss Gabrielle!" A crisp, professional male voice echoed through the dining room. It was Richard Vanguard, the senior managing partner and founder of Vanguard and Associates. I apologize for calling on a Sunday evening, but I wanted to personally deliver the good news. "Go ahead, Richard," I said, keeping my eyes locked dead onto Brielle's suddenly confused face. "Ms. Gabrielle, the acquisition of our firm by your holding company is complete," he announced, his voice crisp and clear. "Should we proceed with firing the new junior associates today?" The silence in the dining room was absolute. Brielle stared at my phone, her mouth opening and closing. The arrogant sneer she had worn just seconds prior melted into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. I kept my eyes locked on her as I leaned closer to the phone. "Yes, Richard," I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of pity. "Effective immediately. Please have security escort the new junior associates out of the building. Do not bother giving them boxes for their personal items. They will not be needing them." I tapped the red button to end the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket. Brielle let out a guttural shriek that scraped the back of her throat. She lunged forward, grabbing the edges of the heavy mahogany table as if she wanted to flip the entire thing over. "You cannot do this!" she screamed, her voice cracking into a hysterical sob. "That was my dream job. You are a jealous, bitter monster." My father rushed forward, wrapping his arms around Brielle's, shaking shoulders, pulling her back before she could try to physically attack me again. My mother flanked her other side, glaring at me with a hatred so deep it made my skin crawl. "You are dead to us!" Calvin spat, his face purple with rage. "Get out of my house and never come back. You are dead to this family." I picked up my heavy legal binders, smoothed out the front of my designer blazer, and calmly walked out the massive front door, leaving them completely drowning in the chaotic mess of their own making. By Tuesday, the whispers had already started circulating through the elite social circles of Atlanta. The sudden cancellation of my country club party, the loud arguments overheard in the lobby, and Brielle's humiliating escort out of the Vanguard and Associates office building by armed security guards were too juicy for the gossips to ignore. Rumors were spreading that the Vance family was completely broke. My mother Beatrice could not stand the thought of losing her social standing. To a woman like her, public perception was more valuable than oxygen. She went into a state of absolute manic desperation. She needed a grand gesture to prove to the entire city that the Vance family was still sitting at the top of the food chain. So she decided to hijack the upcoming Alpha Alumni Charity Gala. It was the most prestigious sorority event of the season, bringing together the wealthiest and most influential Black women in the state. Beatrice bullied her way into becoming the primary host and title sponsor. She booked the Diamond Atrium, one of the most exclusive and expensive venues in the heart of Buckhead. She ordered towering floral arrangements in pink and green caviar towers and a live jazz orchestra. She was burning through tens of thousands of dollars in a matter of days. I knew exactly where that money was coming from. Preston was frantically draining the last reserves of Calvin's church fund, forging authorization signatures to keep my mother's ridiculous facade from crumbling. On Saturday night, the Diamond Atrium was glowing. Valets were rushing back and forth, parking Bentleys and Porsches, while women in stunning evening gowns glided up the marble steps. I arrived precisely an hour after the event began. I wore an emerald silk gown that swept the floor. My hair was styled flawlessly, and a diamond choker rested cold and heavy against my collarbone. I walked past the guests waiting and stepped right up to the velvet rope blocking the main entrance. The clipboard attendant, who knew my mother well, held up her hand to stop me. "I am sorry, Gabrielle," she said with a tight, patronizing smile. "This is an exclusive alumni event. Your mother specifically instructed us that you are not on the guest list. I did not argue. I simply reached into my emerald clutch and handed her a heavy gold foil card. It was a platinum-level VIP sponsor pass. The attendant looked at the card, then looked at me, her jaw dropping slightly. She unhooked the velvet rope without another word. I walked into the grand ballroom, and the atmosphere was electric. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the sea of pink and green gowns. Waiters wearing crisp white uniforms carried heavy silver trays of very expensive champagne through the happily laughing crowd. It did not take long for the whispers to start. Heads turned as I walked confidently toward the center of the room. I was the disgraced daughter, the college dropout, the family embarrassment. Yet here I was, dripping in wealth and looking completely unbothered. It took exactly 3 minutes for my mother to spot me. Beatrice was holding court near the ice sculpture, wearing a heavily beaded pink gown. The moment her eyes locked onto mine, her fake smile vanished. She stomped across the marble floor, her heels clicking aggressively. "What are you doing here?" Beatrice demanded, practically spitting the words. "You are not welcome here. This is an event for educated women, not bitter college dropouts trying to ruin their mother's night." I took a slow sip from a champagne flute. "I am a platinum sponsor, Beatrice," I said loudly enough for the women to hear. "I have every right to be here." My mother sneered, her face twisting with ugly rage. "I do not care what fake pass you printed," she hissed. "You are a jealous failure who wants to embarrass me in front of my sisters." She snapped her fingers at 2 large security guards standing near the ballroom entrance. "Remove this trespasser immediately," she ordered, pointing a manicured finger at my face. "She is disrupting a private charity gala." The large security guards began to aggressively march directly toward me. The surrounding guests fell completely silent, watching the drama unfold. But the guards never made it to me. Suddenly, the live jazz orchestra stopped playing. The abrupt silence was jarring. The lead event organizer stepped onto the main stage and tapped the microphone. A sudden, extremely loud screech of microphone feedback violently echoed through the entire ballroom. "Ladies," the organizer announced, her voice echoing off the crystal chandeliers. "Ladies, we must vacate the premises immediately. The venue owner, Ms. Gabrielle, has just foreclosed on the sponsors' bounced checks. Beatrice, you have 5 minutes to leave." The collective gasp from hundreds of elite women sucked all the air out of the grand ballroom. Beatrice stood completely frozen, her jaw trembling as the reality of her ultimate social demise washed over her. Women she had desperately tried to impress for decades were now whispering and pulling out their phones to record her humiliation. The 2 large security guards who were supposed to throw me out immediately pivoted and placed their heavy hands on my mother's shoulders. They escorted a sobbing Beatrice toward the service exit, past the towering caviar displays and pink floral arrangements she could never afford. I stood near the ice sculpture, sipping my champagne in perfect peace. I knew this was not the end. My family was like a cornered animal, and cornered animals always lash out. By Sunday morning, the entire city was buzzing with the scandal. Calvin knew he was losing control of the narrative. He needed a stage where he held absolute authority. He needed his congregation. His megachurch sat on 20 acres of prime Atlanta real estate, boasting a 3,000-seat sanctuary that rivaled a professional concert hall. I sat in my parked car outside the massive glass building, watching families pour into the morning service. I knew exactly what my father was planning to do. He was going to use the pulpit to weaponize the community against me. I waited until the service reached its absolute peak. The massive choir had just finished a rousing gospel set, and the lights in the sanctuary dimmed to a dramatic purple hue. Calvin stepped up to the clear acrylic podium, wearing a custom-tailored charcoal suit. He gripped the edges of the pulpit and lowered his head, letting out a deep theatrical sigh that echoed through the state-of-the-art sound system. He was putting on the performance of his life. "Brothers and sisters," Calvin began, his voice booming with fake sorrow. "Today my heart is heavy with a burden no father should ever have to carry. We read in the scriptures about the prodigal son who lost his way. But today I stand before you to speak about a prodigal daughter. A daughter who has let the devil of greed take root in her soul. A daughter who has turned against her own flesh and blood to destroy the very foundation of this family. The congregation murmured in sympathetic agreement. Thousands of people nodded along, completely under his spell. Calvin wiped a non-existent tear from his eye. "She is trying to bankrupt us!" Calvin cried out, his voice rising in manufactured, righteous anger. "She is launching vicious legal attacks against her sister and trying to smear the good name of this church. The devil is using her to stop the holy work we are doing here. She wants to stop the new youth center. She wants to take the very roof over our heads because her heart is poisoned with bitter jealousy. We must pray for her soul, but we must also cast out the evil she brings to our door." The crowd began to shout their agreement. Amens and hallelujahs filled the massive room. He was whipping 3,000 people into a frenzy, turning them into a mob ready to tear me apart to protect their beloved pastor. It was the perfect manipulation. It was time to pull the curtain down on his holy show. I pushed open the heavy wooden double doors at the back of the sanctuary. The sunlight from the lobby poured into the darkened room, casting a long shadow down the center aisle. I stepped onto the plush burgundy carpet. I wore a sharp white tailored pantsuit that stood out starkly against the dim lighting. The usher standing near the entrance tried to grab my arm, but Marcus, my bodyguard, stepped in front of him with a look that promised severe consequences. I began my long walk down the center aisle right as Calvin was calling for the altar call. My hard heels clicked against the floorboards beneath the carpet. One by one, the people in the back pews turned to look at me. The whispers started instantly spreading like a wave, moving from the back of the massive room all the way to the front. The congregation parted like the Red Sea as I walked. Calvin stopped speaking. He stared at me from his elevated stage, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the acrylic podium. "Get out of this sanctuary!" Calvin bellowed, his voice echoing through the massive speakers. "You bring dark energy into this holy place, Gabrielle. Ushers, remove this woman immediately. She is trying to disrupt the word of the Lord." I did not stop walking. I did not yell back. I simply reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I stopped right at the front row, looking directly up at my father. I opened a text thread to my private tech team. They had tapped into the church audio-visual network an hour ago. I hit send. Within 3 seconds, the enormous LED screens behind the choir loft went entirely black. The vibrant graphics displaying Bible verses vanished. The congregation let out a confused murmur. Calvin turned around to look at the screens, his face twisting with sudden panic. The giant screens flickered back to life. But they were no longer showing scriptures or donation prompts. They were displaying high-resolution images of highly classified banking statements. The documents were magnified so clearly that even the people in the very last row of the balcony could read the bold black text. These were not just any bank statements. They were the private joint accounts belonging to Calvin and Preston. I watched the faces of the church elders sitting in the front pews contort in pure horror as they read the transaction lines. There, right on the massive screens for 3,000 devoted members to see, was the irrefutable proof. The screen highlighted a direct wire transfer of $500,000 pulled directly from the Community Youth Center Building Fund, the very fund these hardworking people had been donating to for 3 years. The next slide popped up immediately, showing exactly where that $500,000 went. It was a receipt of purchase for a massive luxury yacht registered in Miami, Florida. The yacht was registered under Preston's name. The silence in the sanctuary shattered. 3,000 people erupted in absolute rage. Women were screaming. Church deacons were jumping out of their seats and pointing at the stage. The people realized in real time that their trusted pastor and his son-in-law had stolen their hard-earned money to fund a secret life of luxury. Calvin stumbled backward, knocking the microphone off the podium. He was completely exposed. Just as the congregation surged forward toward the stage, the heavy double doors at the back of the church swung open again with a loud crash. Everyone turned around. A team of men and women wearing dark windbreakers with yellow block letters spelling Federal Bureau of Investigation marched purposefully into the sanctuary. The federal agents moved in perfect unison, walking straight down the center aisle. Their boots hit the plush burgundy carpet with a heavy thud that sounded louder than the screaming congregation. The lead agent held up a gold badge. Nobody tried to stop them. The ushers who had been ready to throw me out just minutes ago were now backing away with their hands raised in the air. The church elders in the front row were shouting at my father, demanding answers about the youth center funds. The massive screens behind the altar were still glowing with the bank statements showing the $500,000 wire transfer for Preston's luxury yacht. The absolute betrayal hung in the air, suffocating everyone in the room. I stood frozen at the front of the church, watching the empire my father built crumble into dust. Calvin looked like he was going to be sick. He gripped the edge of the clear acrylic podium so tightly his knuckles were completely white. He was trapped. There was nowhere for him to run. But Preston was not ready to surrender. I watched out of the corner of my eye as my fraudulent brother-in-law slowly backed away from the stage. He let go of Brielle's hand, ignoring her confused tears. While everyone was distracted by the federal agents marching down the aisle, Preston slipped behind the velvet curtain near the choir loft. He was heading straight for the emergency exit that led to the private parking lot. He thought he was smarter than everyone else. He thought he could abandon his fake life in Atlanta and escape to his secret family in Miami. But I was always 3 steps ahead. I gave a subtle nod to Marcus, who was standing near the front pew. Marcus tapped his earpiece and signaled to the rest of my private security team. Just as Preston pushed open the heavy side door, he slammed directly into a wall of solid muscle. 2 of my security guards grabbed him by the lapels of his expensive suit. They lifted him off his feet and threw him violently back into the sanctuary. Preston crashed onto the polished wooden floor, sliding right to the feet of the lead federal agent. The agent looked down at him and calmly pulled a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. The sight of Preston being handcuffed on the sanctuary floor sent the congregation into another frenzy of rage. People were throwing their church programs and yelling for justice. Brielle was sobbing hysterically, pulling at her hair and screaming that it was all a mistake. The noise was absolutely deafening. Beatrice realized in that exact moment that her perfect social image was permanently destroyed. Her son-in-law was a thief being arrested by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Her husband was a disgraced pastor who had stolen from his own devoted followers. Her daughter was married to a bigamist. Beatrice needed to stop the momentum. She needed to manipulate the situation to buy time, or at least distract the federal agents from placing Calvin in handcuffs. My mother has always been an actress, and this was her most desperate performance. Beatrice let out a highly exaggerated gasp that echoed over the screaming crowd. She clutched her chest with both hands, her eyes rolling back into her head. She swayed on her expensive heels and collapsed dramatically onto the carpeted steps of the altar. She lay completely motionless, her heavily beaded dress sparkling under the stage lights. Brielle screamed, dropping to her knees next to our mother, crying out for someone to call an ambulance. The federal agents immediately stopped reading Preston his rights. The entire congregation gasped in horror, watching their beloved First Lady apparently suffer a massive heart attack right before their eyes. The church always kept a dedicated emergency medical team on standby during the Sunday services because of the massive crowd size. 3 paramedics sprinted down the side aisle carrying heavy red trauma bags and a portable defibrillator. They pushed past the federal agents and dropped to the floor next to Beatrice. The lead emergency technician, a man named David, who had attended our church for 20 years, began checking her vitals. He ripped open a blood pressure cuff and wrapped it tightly around her arm. Calvin finally unfroze. He stumbled down from the stage, dropping to his knees beside his wife. He was hovering over the paramedics, looking absolutely terrified. I stood just a few feet away, watching my mother with cold calculation. I knew her better than anyone. I saw the slight flutter of her eyelids. I noticed that her breathing was entirely too steady for a woman suffering cardiac arrest. She was faking it. She was putting on a show to save Calvin from being walked out of his own church in front of 3,000 people. The distraction was working perfectly. The congregation had shifted from angry to deeply concerned. The federal agents were standing back waiting for the medical emergency to be resolved before proceeding with their arrests. Then the performance took a terrifying and completely unscripted turn. Calvin was holding his wife's hand, praying loudly for her recovery when he suddenly stopped. His eyes went wide. He let out a harsh, wet cough that sounded like a tearing inside his chest. He covered his mouth with his free hand, but the coughing fit only intensified. His entire body shook violently with each heave. When he finally pulled his hand away, a collective shriek went up from the front row. Calvin's palm was completely covered in dark crimson blood. He coughed again, and a thick spray of blood splattered onto the pristine white steps of the altar landing inches from where Beatrice was pretending to be unconscious. Calvin collapsed backward, clutching his stomach and gasping for air. The lead technician, David, abandoned his fake patient and scrambled over to my father. David pulled a small medical tablet from his pocket. The clinic attached to the church handled all the primary care for the pastoral staff. David swiped rapidly across the screen, his face draining of all color. He looked from the tablet to Calvin and then down at the blood staining the holy altar. David looked up, his voice trembling as it carried through the silent sanctuary. "Sir, your wife's heart is completely fine," he announced, staring directly at my father. "But your blood test from last week's physical just flagged in the system. The lab results just came back as critical. Someone has been slowly poisoning you with arsenic for months." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. The entire congregation stood frozen in absolute shock. Beatrice slowly opened her eyes, abandoning her fake heart attack entirely. She did not look at her dying husband. She did not look at the paramedics or the federal agents surrounding her family. Beatrice looked directly at me. I stood perfectly still, my eyes locking onto hers. The puzzle pieces suddenly violently snapped into place. She was not just protecting Preston, she was protecting the money she needed to escape after Calvin was dead. I stared dead at Beatrice, realizing my mother was not just a social climbing narcissist, but a cold-blooded killer. The crystal chandeliers of the diamond atrium seemed to mock my mother, as she stood frozen in absolute terror. The elite women of Atlanta were no longer whispering, they were openly laughing and pointing their manicured fingers at her. Beatrice Vance, the self-proclaimed queen of Southern high society, was being escorted out the service exit by the same security guards she had tried to unleash on me. She stumbled out into the humid night air, her pink designer gown dragging across the dirty pavement. The entire city knew the Vance family was drowning in debt. By Sunday morning, the scandal had exploded across every social media platform and local news blog. Calvin was completely cornered. His carefully constructed empire of lies was crumbling into dust, and he knew he had only one place left where he possessed absolute power. He needed his congregation. His megachurch sat on 20 acres of prime real estate, boasting a massive sanctuary that rivaled a professional concert hall. I parked my car near the back of the enormous lot, watching thousands of devoted members pour through the glass doors. I knew exactly what my father was preparing to do. He was going to use his pulpit to weaponize his followers against me. I slipped inside the building just as the service reached its peak. The massive choir had finished a rousing gospel set, and the lights dimmed to a dramatic purple hue. Calvin stepped up to the clear acrylic podium, wearing a custom-tailored charcoal suit. He gripped the edges of the pulpit and lowered his head, letting out a deep theatrical sigh that echoed through the modern sound system. He was putting on the performance of his life. Brothers and sisters. Calvin began, his voice booming with manufactured sorrow. Today my heart is heavy with a burden no father should ever have to carry. We read in the scriptures about the prodigal son who lost his way. But today I stand before you to speak about a prodigal daughter. A daughter who has let the devil of greed take root in her dark soul. A daughter who has turned against her own flesh and blood to destroy the very foundation of our holy community. The congregation murmured in sympathetic agreement. Thousands of people nodded along completely under his manipulative spell. Calvin wiped a non-existent tear from his eye. "She is trying to bankrupt us," Calvin cried out, his voice rising in righteous anger. She is launching vicious legal attacks against her innocent sister and trying to smear the good name of this church. The devil is using her to stop the holy work we are doing here. She wants to shut down our new community youth center. She wants to take the very roof over our heads because her heart is poisoned with bitter jealousy. She is a prodigal daughter possessed by the devil of greed. We must pray for her soul, but we must also stand together and cast out the evil she brings to our door. Do not let her lies divide us. The crowd began to shout their agreement. People were standing up, raising their hands and yelling amens that vibrated through the floorboards. He was whipping 3,000 people into a frenzy, turning them into an angry mob, ready to protect their beloved pastor at all costs. Calvin raised his hands, calling for the altar call, inviting people to come forward and pray against the spiritual attacks on their church. It was the perfect manipulation. It was time to pull the curtain down on his holy show. I pushed open the heavy wooden double doors at the back of the sanctuary. The bright sunlight from the lobby poured into the darkened room, casting a long, dramatic shadow down the center aisle. I stepped onto the plush burgundy carpet. I wore a sharp white tailored pantsuit that stood out starkly against the dim purple lighting. I began my long, slow walk directly down the center aisle. My heels clicked against the floorboards beneath the carpet. One by one, the people in the back pews turned to look at me. The whispers started instantly spreading like a wave, moving from the back of the massive room all the way to the front. The congregation parted, creating a wide path as I walked. Calvin stopped speaking mid-sentence. He stared at me from his elevated stage, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the acrylic podium. His face twisted with absolute panic. "Get out of this sanctuary!" Calvin bellowed, his voice echoing aggressively through the massive speakers. "You bring dark energy into this holy place, Gabrielle. Ushers, remove this woman immediately. She is trying to disrupt the word of the Lord." I did not stop walking. I did not yell back or try to defend myself against his ridiculous accusations. I simply reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I stopped right at the front row, looking directly up at my father. I opened a text thread to my private information technology team. They had tapped into the church audiovisual network 2 hours prior, bypassing the basic security firewalls with ease. I typed a single word and hit send. Within 3 seconds, the enormous digital screens behind the choir loft went entirely black. The vibrant graphics displaying Bible verses and donation prompts vanished instantly. The congregation let out a confused murmur. Calvin turned around to look at the screens, his mouth opening and closing silently. The giant screens suddenly flickered back to life, but they were no longer showing scriptures. They were displaying high-resolution images of highly classified banking statements. The financial documents were magnified so clearly that even the people in the very last row of the balcony could read the bold black text. These were not just any bank statements. They were the private joint accounts belonging to Calvin and Preston. I watched the faces of the church elders sitting in the front pews contort in pure horror as they read the transaction lines. There, right on the massive screens for 3,000 devoted members to see, was the irrefutable proof of their corruption. The screen highlighted a direct wire transfer of exactly $500,000. The origin account was clearly labeled as the Community Youth Center Building Fund. The very fund these hardworking people had been blindly donating to for 3 long years. The next slide popped up immediately on the massive screens, showing exactly where that $500,000 went. It was a receipt of purchase for a massive luxury yacht registered in Miami, Florida. The yacht was registered directly under Preston's name. The brief silence in the sanctuary shattered into a million pieces. 3,000 people erupted in absolute visceral rage. Women were screaming at the top of their lungs. Church deacons were jumping out of their seats and pointing angrily at the stage. The congregation realized in real time that their trusted pastor and his arrogant son-in-law had stolen their hard-earned money to fund a secret life of extreme luxury. They had sacrificed their own paychecks for a youth center that was never going to be built. Calvin stumbled backward, knocking the microphone completely off the podium. He was completely exposed, and there was nowhere left for him to hide. The crowd surged forward toward the altar, their voices blending into a deafening roar of betrayal. Just as the mob was about to reach the stage, the heavy double doors at the back of the church swung open again with a loud, echoing crash. Everyone turned around. Suddenly, federal agents walked purposefully through the church's double doors. The flashing red and blue lights of the ambulance painted the white walls of the hospital emergency room. I followed the stretcher through the sliding glass doors, watching the paramedics bark orders at the trauma team. Calvin was pale and gasping for air, his custom-tailored suit now stained with his own blood. The federal agents had secured the hospital wing, standing guard at the entrances while they processed Preston back at the downtown bureau. Beatrice sat in the waiting room looking like a ghost. Her pink beaded gown was out of place against the sterile plastic chairs. She stared straight ahead, refusing to make eye contact with me or the nurses who offered her water. The reality of her sinister plot was hanging heavy in the cold hospital air. She had spent months slipping arsenic into his daily vitamin shakes. It took the doctors 2 hours to stabilize his failing organs. The lead toxicologist walked into the waiting area, holding a thick manila folder. He confirmed what the church paramedic had discovered. The arsenic levels in Calvin's blood were extraordinarily high, indicating a slow and methodical poisoning over the course of 6 long months. The timeline matched perfectly. 6 months ago, Preston had officially petitioned the church elders for full administrative control over the megachurch finances. Calvin had hesitated, wanting to maintain his iron grip on the building funds. Beatrice realized her husband was standing in the way of her ultimate payday. She wanted to drain the church dry and escape to a tropical island with Preston's stolen millions before the congregation ever noticed the missing money. Taking Calvin out of the equation was her only path to absolute financial control. She traded her marriage vows for a life insurance payout and a luxury yacht. The federal agents standing near the vending machines took careful notes. Attempted murder was now added to the growing list of federal charges. Beatrice finally looked at me, her eyes dark and completely empty of any maternal warmth. She did not say a single word as 2 agents approached her holding a pair of heavy metal handcuffs. They read her rights right there in the sterile waiting room and marched her out the front doors. I walked slowly down the linoleum hallway toward the intensive care unit. Calvin's room was at the very end of the corridor. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor echoed through the cracked wooden door. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The great and powerful megachurch pastor was reduced to a fragile old man tangled in plastic tubes and wires. He looked up at me as I approached the side of his hospital bed. His skin was gray and his hands trembled as he reached out toward me. "Gabrielle," he whispered, his voice, a weak and raspy shadow of his normal booming tone. "You have to help me. The feds are going to freeze all my accounts by tomorrow morning. I need the best defense attorneys in Atlanta. I need private medical care. You are a wealthy woman now, Gabrielle. You own properties and businesses. I am your father. You have to pay for my legal defense and get me out of this absolute nightmare." He was actually crying now, thick tears rolling down his sunken cheeks. He was begging the same daughter he had just tried to destroy in front of 3,000 people. I looked down at his shaking hand, but I did not reach out to take it. The silence in the hospital room felt heavy and suffocating. "You stood on a stage 2 hours ago and called me a demon," I said, keeping my voice low and completely steady. "You told your congregation that I was poisoned with greed. You stood back and watched while your wife poisoned you with actual arsenic just so she could steal your money. You threw me out of your house and told me I was dead to you." I leaned slightly closer to his bed, making sure he heard every single word. "I am not your savior, Calvin. I am not going to write a check to save a man who built his entire life on lies and manipulation. You are going to face the federal government completely on your own." I stepped back from the bed and turned around, walking away, as he began to sob loudly into his thin hospital pillow. As I walked out of the intensive care unit, I spotted Brielle pacing frantically near the nurse's station. Her hair was a messy nest of curls, and her expensive makeup was smeared halfway down her face. She was speaking rapidly into her cell phone, begging someone for a short-term loan. Preston was sitting in a federal holding cell and his bail was going to be astronomical. All of their credit cards had already been declined. The bank accounts were frozen solid by the government. Brielle was utterly desperate for cash. I stepped behind a tall promotional banner and watched her. She ended the call and let out an angry scream that echoed down the hall. She looked up and down the corridor before sneaking quietly toward Calvin's room. She thought I had already left the hospital entirely. I knew exactly what she was going to do. I waited a few minutes before following her path. I walked toward the main elevator bank at the far end of the corridor. I knew Calvin kept his prized diamond-encrusted watch on the personal belongings tray right next to his hospital bed. It was his signature piece of jewelry that he wore to every televised sermon and charity gala. Brielle needed quick liquid cash, and a massive diamond watch could easily cover a bail bondsman fee. I stood directly in front of the closed metal elevator doors with my arms crossed tightly over my chest. I heard her heavy footsteps rushing down the hallway. Brielle turned the corner, clutching her oversized designer purse tightly against her chest. She hit the elevator call button repeatedly, breathing heavily and checking over her shoulder. She finally noticed me standing there in the shadows. Her eyes went wide with sheer panic. She tried to push past me to reach the emergency stairs, but I stepped sideways, blocking her only path of escape. "You can stop running, Brielle," I said softly, staring directly into her terrified eyes. "I know you just stole his watch off the tray while he was crying." Brielle opened her mouth to deny it, but no words came out. I tilted my head and offered her a small, cold smile. "That watch is a cheap fake," I told her. "Just like your law degree. By the way, I called Howard University this morning." Brielle's mouth hung open in silent shock as she stared at the cheap fake diamond watch in her shaking hands. I stepped closer to her, watching the last shred of her arrogant pride dissolve into absolute terror. "You really thought I would not find out?" I asked, my voice echoing coldly off the sterile hospital walls. "You thought you could hack into my private cloud drive, steal my undergraduate thesis, and sell it to a state senator's son without leaving a digital footprint? You did not just fail your law classes, Brielle. You committed a federal cybercrime. The university expelled you months ago, and tomorrow morning the Federal Bureau of Investigation is officially indicting the boy who bought it." I watched the color drain completely from her flawless face. Her hands trembled so violently that she dropped the fake watch onto the hard linoleum floor, where it shattered into dozens of cheap, useless pieces. She fell to her knees, weeping hysterically and begging me to help her fix it. I turned my back on her and walked calmly toward the elevator, leaving her hyperventilating in the hallway, completely destroyed by her own catastrophic incompetence. It had been 3 days since the megachurch sanctuary turned into an active federal crime scene. The entire city of Atlanta was still reeling from the explosive financial scandal. Calvin was recovering in his intensive care hospital bed, with 2 armed federal agents standing guard outside his door 24 hours a day. Beatrice was sitting in a cold federal holding cell, refusing to speak to anyone without her overpriced defense attorney, who demanded a cash retainer she could no longer afford. The massive church building was officially boarded up and locked down by the government pending a forensic audit of every single donation. I had returned to my downtown luxury penthouse, enjoying the absolute silence. The walls were made of floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the glittering city skyline. I felt a deep, profound sense of peace knowing the toxic empire that had suffocated me for decades was finally reduced to rubble. I walked into my massive marble kitchen and opened the custom refrigerator to pour myself a glass of chilled, filtered water. The sunset was painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. Suddenly, the digital security panel on my living room wall glowed bright red. A silent alarm triggered, sending a high-priority warning notification directly to my phone. Someone had violently bypassed the main lobby security desk and manually overridden my private elevator access. I did not panic. I did not run for the panic room. I simply set my glass down on the cool marble island and waited patiently in the center of the room. The heavy, solid oak front door of my penthouse was violently kicked open. Preston stood in the doorway, breathing heavily, his custom-tailored suit wrinkled and severely stained with nervous sweat. He looked completely unhinged. His eyes were bloodshot, darting frantically around the room, and his hands were shaking uncontrollably. He slammed the heavy door behind him and manually locked the deadbolt. I knew exactly how he had gotten out of federal custody so quickly. A mysterious and incredibly dangerous loan shark down in Miami had fronted his astronomical cash bail. Preston had borrowed millions from people who did not forgive debts, and now his time was rapidly running out. "You think you won, Gabrielle?" he spat, taking an aggressive step into my pristine living room. "You think you can just burn my entire life to the ground and walk away completely untouched?" I stood perfectly still, watching him unravel before my eyes. "You burned your own life to the ground, Preston?" I replied, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "You stole $500,000 from hardworking families to buy a luxury yacht for your secret second life. You are going to a federal penitentiary for a very long time." Preston let out a loud, manic laugh that echoed harshly against the glass walls. He reached inside his ruined jacket pocket and pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. He marched directly over to the kitchen island and slammed it down onto the marble surface, spilling dozens of glossy photographs everywhere. I looked down at the pictures scattered across the counter. They were highly compromising, scandalous images of me engaging in illegal and highly immoral activities. The images were incredibly realistic, capturing my exact facial features and body language in terrifying, high-definition detail. "These are going to every major news outlet in the entire country by midnight." Preston threatened, his voice trembling with desperate, violent aggression. "They will go directly to the Vanguard Board of Directors. They will go to your elite social circle. Your pristine corporate reputation will be completely destroyed, and you will lose everything just like I did." I picked up one of the glossy photographs, examining the lighting and shadows closely. I knew immediately they were artificial intelligence-generated deepfakes. He had paid someone to digitally paste my face onto extremely damaging scenarios. But the technology was flawless, and public perception was always ruthless. "You are going to wire exactly $5 million into my offshore account right now, Gabrielle," he demanded, pointing a shaking, sweat-slicked finger right at my face. "You are going to pay off my Miami debts, so I can disappear to an island, or I hit send and ruin your life forever." I looked at Preston, standing there sweating and desperate, and I felt absolutely nothing but pure pity. I did not flinch. I did not argue with his insane demands. I did not beg him to spare my reputation. I simply dropped the fake photograph back onto the marble counter and walked gracefully over to my custom-built wine fridge. I pulled out a very expensive bottle of vintage red wine and grabbed a heavy crystal glass. I uncorked the bottle, listening to the satisfying pop as the cork released from the glass neck. I poured the dark crimson liquid into the glass, taking my absolute time to ensure a perfect pour. Preston watched me in stunned, furious silence, his ultimate blackmail attempt completely and utterly ignored. I picked up my phone from the counter and calmly opened my smart home security application. I navigated to the main door controls and set a digital timer for exactly 10 seconds. Then I pressed the master button to remotely unlock the deadbolt on my front door. "What are you doing?" Preston demanded, his voice pitching upward in sudden absolute panic. "10 seconds until what?" I took a slow, deliberate sip of my wine, tasting the rich, dark cherry notes on my tongue. 5 seconds, I said softly, looking directly into his terrified eyes. 4, 3, 2, 1. A loud, sharp beep sounded from the front entryway as the heavy electronic lock disengaged. The massive oak door swung open wide, hitting the wall with a loud thud. A furious white woman carrying a screaming infant baby on her hip marched aggressively into my penthouse. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a messy, frantic ponytail, and her eyes were burning with pure homicidal rage. She carried a massive designer diaper bag slung over her shoulder. She stopped dead in the middle of my living room, completely ignoring my presence, and locked her furious, murderous gaze directly onto Preston. Preston dropped the remaining fake photos onto the floor, his jaw hitting his chest as all the blood drained rapidly from his face. The woman shifted the crying baby on her hip and glared at him with absolute, unadulterated venom. "So this is the highly demanding consulting job in Atlanta you have been doing for 3 years, Preston?" she asked, her voice vibrating with enough rage to shatter the glass windows. The blonde woman stood furiously in the center of my immaculate living room, clutching the crying infant tightly to her chest. She glared at Preston with a fiery intensity that completely paralyzed him where he stood. I took another slow, deliberate sip of my expensive red wine, watching the absolute destruction of his carefully hidden double life unfold right in my own home. Preston opened his mouth to speak, but his voice completely failed him. He took a weak, trembling step backward, nearly tripping over the edge of my thick Persian rug. The woman did not break eye contact as she took an aggressive step closer to him. She demanded to know why he was standing in a luxury Atlanta penthouse instead of attending the supposed emergency consulting meetings he had claimed were keeping him away from their beautiful home in Miami. She told him she had received an anonymous email containing flight records and highly classified banking statements just a few hours ago. I smiled quietly into my wine glass, knowing my private information technology team had executed my instructions perfectly to ensure she arrived exactly at this moment. The furious woman rocked the crying baby on her hip and asked Preston if this was how he funded their lavish beachfront lifestyle all these years. She wanted to know exactly whose money he had been stealing to pay for their brand new luxury yacht and their highly exclusive private club memberships down in sunny Florida. Preston held his hands up in a pathetic gesture of surrender, begging her to lower her voice and calm down. He looked desperately around my massive penthouse, searching for any possible excuse to explain away his massive deceit, but there was absolutely nowhere for him to hide from the devastating truth. Before Preston could formulate a single believable lie, the heavy, solid oak door swung wide open once again. Brielle rushed breathlessly into the grand entryway, her expensive designer heels clicking loudly and frantically against the polished marble floor. She had clearly raced across the entire city the moment she realized Preston had somehow made his astronomical federal bail. She was desperately trying to find him and stop him from doing anything else that would completely ruin her fragile social standing in the elite circles of Atlanta. Brielle stopped dead in her tracks when she saw the chaotic scene unfolding in my pristine living room. She looked at me standing calmly by the kitchen island, holding a crystal glass of wine, like I was watching a theatrical play. Then her wide eyes darted over to Preston, who was sweating profusely and trembling like a cornered animal caught in a deadly trap. Finally, her gaze landed squarely on the furious blonde woman holding a small crying baby in the center of the room. The physical resemblance between Preston and the infant was absolutely undeniable to anyone with functioning eyes. They shared the exact same shape of their eyes and the exact same strong jawline. I watched my younger sister's face cycle rapidly through sheer confusion and absolute horror as her brain struggled to process the devastating reality standing right in front of her. The secret life her husband had been living behind her back was no longer a secret. I fully expected Brielle to explode into a fit of righteous, explosive anger. I expected her to scream at Preston for betraying their sacred marriage vows and humiliating her in front of the sister she hated so much. But my sister had always been hopelessly addicted to the shallow optics of high society and the fake perfection she projected to the world. Instead of lashing out with dignity, she did something completely and utterly pathetic. Her knees buckled slightly, and she reached out with shaking hands to grab Preston's wrinkled suit arm. She looked up at him with dark mascara-stained tears streaming down her flawless face and begged him to explain it all away. She told him they could fix this quiet mess together if they just kept it a secret from the church and the media. She actually told him she did not care about the furious woman from Miami or the secret innocent baby as long as he promised to stay legally married to her in Atlanta. She begged him to think about their expensive country club memberships and their upcoming charity galas that were supposed to be the highlight of her social season. She sobbed uncontrollably about how terribly embarrassed she would be if the other wealthy wives found out her perfect husband had a completely separate family hidden in another state. Brielle was willing to swallow the ultimate personal betrayal just to keep her fake, perfect life completely intact. She clung to his jacket, crying hysterically and pleading with him not to abandon her in the middle of this massive public scandal. She promised him she would be a better, more compliant wife, and that they could somehow spin the story to the eager media to protect their precious social standing forever. Preston looked down at Brielle, clinging so desperately to his ruined jacket. A slow, deeply cruel smile spread across his sweating face. The panic that had paralyzed him just moments ago suddenly morphed into pure, vicious arrogance. He let out a harsh, mocking laugh that made Brielle flinch backward. He reached down and violently shoved her away from his body. Brielle stumbled backward, her designer heels catching awkwardly on the thick rug, and she fell hard onto the cold marble floor. Preston looked down at her with utter, unmasked disgust. He told her she was nothing but a fragile, insecure little girl playing dress-up in a grown woman's world. He yelled that he never actually loved her, and that their entire grand wedding and subsequent marriage was nothing but a highly convenient business transaction for him. "You were just a dumb meal ticket," Preston spat at her while she wept pitifully on the floor, holding her bruised arm. He told her she was the absolute easiest target he had ever met in his entire life, and that he only married her to get his greedy hands on her father's megachurch bank accounts. I set my wineglass down on the marble island and walked slowly toward the center of the room. I did not offer my hand to help my crying sister off the floor. Instead, I pulled a thick, heavy legal document from my tailored blazer pocket. I stepped right up to Preston and shoved the heavy stack of papers hard against his chest, forcing him to take them. I told him he had exactly 20 days to legally respond to the massive civil lawsuit I was personally filing against him. I was suing him for every single dollar he had stolen from my family and the innocent congregation he had ruthlessly defrauded. Preston clutched the thick lawsuit papers, looking like he was about to pass out from the sheer crushing weight of his rapidly crumbling reality. He looked desperately toward the open front door, hoping to make a quick escape, but the furious blonde woman from Miami blocked his path completely. She shifted the crying baby to her left hip and reached deep into her massive designer diaper bag with her free hand. She pulled out a thick, heavy stack of highly official-looking documents that were prominently stamped with federal government seals. She threw the massive stack of papers directly into Brielle's lap, where she was still sobbing uncontrollably on the cold marble floor. The Miami wife looked down at my pathetic sister with a harsh mixture of pity and absolute disgust. She told Brielle that Preston did not just use her for high society optics and free expensive dinners at the country club. She told her that Preston had completely stolen her identity the very same week they were married in that lavish church ceremony. "He used your personal social security number to open 15 illegal shell companies across the country," the Miami wife declared, her voice dripping with pure toxic venom. She pointed an angry finger directly at the official papers scattered across Brielle's lap. "The federal agents raided our beachfront estate early this morning. They completely seized everything we owned because of the massive financial fraud he committed using your name." Brielle picked up the top page with wildly shaking hands, staring in absolute horror at the bold red ink stamped across the top of the official letterhead. The Miami wife delivered the final devastating blow that would end Brielle's life as she knew it. "The Internal Revenue Service just put a $3 million tax lien directly in your name." Brielle stared blindly at the red ink stamped across the official government documents. $3 million was a number she could not even comprehend, let alone pay back to the federal government. She dropped the papers onto the marble floor and buried her face in her hands, sobbing so violently her entire body shook. The Miami wife did not offer a single ounce of sympathy. She simply adjusted her crying baby on her hip and turned around, walking right out the front door without looking back. Preston stood frozen against the kitchen island, completely ruined. I watched them both drowning in the exact misery they had created for themselves. I walked out of my own penthouse, leaving them to clean up the mess they brought to my doorstep. I expected them to flee the state or beg for a plea deal, but I severely underestimated the sheer psychotic denial of my mother. Beatrice was released from the federal holding cell 2 days later after draining the last hidden emergency fund she had stashed in a local credit union. Instead of preparing for her impending criminal trial, she immediately went into a frantic state of aggressive damage control. She was utterly terrified of losing her precious status among the elite women of Atlanta high society. The rumors were already spreading rapidly through the country club locker rooms and charity board meetings. Beatrice decided the only way to silence the vicious gossip was to throw the most lavish and expensive party the city had ever seen. She forced Preston and Brielle to host a massive vow renewal ceremony to project a fake image of absolute financial stability and marital bliss. Brielle and Preston absolutely hated each other now. They slept in separate rooms in their heavily mortgaged mansion and barely spoke unless they were screaming about the massive tax lien. But Beatrice commanded them to play the parts of a deeply in love wealthy couple. She sent out 350 heavy gold embossed invitations to every major politician, business owner, and socialite in the state of Georgia. She booked the grand ballroom at the most exclusive historic hotel in downtown Atlanta, promising to pay the exorbitant fees using a fraudulent line of credit. She hired the most expensive floral designers to drape the entire room in white roses. She even booked a classical string quartet to play romantic music as the guests arrived. I found out about the massive event through my extensive network of corporate contacts. I knew Beatrice was planning a 5-star seated dinner featuring imported caviar and dry-aged steak to prove the Vance family was still sitting at the very top of the social food chain. I decided it was the perfect opportunity to serve them a heavy dose of reality. I made a quick phone call to my private wealth manager and instructed him to look into the elite catering company Beatrice had hired for the vow renewal. The company was highly respected, but secretly struggling with deep corporate debt following a bad expansion deal. I did not just cancel my mother's catering order, I bought the entire catering company outright. By Friday afternoon, I was the majority shareholder and acting chief executive officer of the very business responsible for feeding my mother's high society guests. I called the head chef and gave him a very specific and highly unusual set of instructions for the Saturday night gala. I told him to completely scrap the expensive gourmet menu and cancel the premium meat orders. I replaced the elegant 5-star feast with the absolute cheapest food I could possibly find. I paid the chefs triple their usual salary just to ensure they followed my exact directions without asking any questions. Saturday evening arrived with a heavy, humid heat settling over the city of Atlanta. I parked my car across the street from the historic hotel and watched the endless line of luxury vehicles pull up to the valet stand. 350 elite guests walked up the grand marble steps, wearing expensive tuxedos and designer evening gowns. Inside the grand ballroom, Beatrice was parading around in a shimmering silver dress, acting like she was still the untouchable queen of the city. She smiled wildly and clinked her champagne glass with wealthy politicians, completely ignoring the fact that she was facing years in a federal prison. Brielle and Preston stood at the front of the room holding hands and forcing incredibly stiff fake smiles for the hired photographers. They recited renewed vows of love and loyalty through tightly gritted teeth, looking like they wanted to strangle each other right there on the altar. The grand double doors to the kitchen finally swung open, signaling the start of the highly anticipated dinner service. The guests took their seats at the massive round tables decorated with towering crystal centerpieces and white orchids. A small army of waiters marched into the ballroom, carrying heavy silver platters covered with polished metal domes. Beatrice beamed with absolute pride, waiting for her wealthy peers to be dazzled by the culinary display. The head waiter gave a subtle nod, and the staff lifted the silver domes in perfect unison. The grand ballroom fell into an immediate stunned silence. There was no dry-aged steak or imported caviar. Sitting in the center of the fine china plates were lukewarm, greasy fast food burgers, wrapped in cheap yellow paper. Beside the smashed burgers were soggy piles of cold French fries leaking grease onto the expensive linen tablecloths. A few stray packets of bright red ketchup were scattered carelessly across the beautiful table settings, adding to the absolute insult of the meal. The smell of cheap fried food and stale onions immediately filled the elegant ballroom. The elite guests stared down at their plates in absolute disgust and utter confusion. Wealthy socialites covered their noses and whispered harshly to their husbands. Beatrice stood up so fast her chair tipped over and crashed loudly against the wooden dance floor. Her face turned a deep, blotchy shade of purple as she stared at the cold, fast food sitting on her own plate. She began screaming frantically at the waiters, demanding to know where the real food was and threatening to sue the catering company for ruining her perfect night. Brielle buried her face in her hands, sobbing loudly at the head table as her carefully constructed high society image completely imploded in front of 350 people. Preston just stared blankly at a soggy French fry, realizing his fake wealthy life was completely over. Beatrice desperately tried to save face and regain control of the disastrous situation. She grabbed a microphone from the stage and let out a loud, manic laugh, telling the disgusted crowd that the meal was just a silly joke to keep things fun and lighthearted. She frantically urged the wealthy guests to open the luxurious party favors sitting at their place settings. She promised them that the small silk boxes contained exclusive artisan chocolates imported directly from Switzerland. The guests hesitated, but slowly began untying the thick satin ribbons and opening the elegant little boxes. The ballroom went completely dead silent once again. The wealthy politicians and elite socialites reached into the boxes, but they did not pull out fine imported chocolates. They pulled out perfectly folded printed documents stamped with official red government seals. They were certified copies of Preston's active federal arrest warrants and official notices of Brielle's $3 million Internal Revenue Service tax lien. The guests gasped in shock as their eyes scanned the horrifying legal papers. Whispers of severe financial fraud and massive tax evasion echoed rapidly through the huge room. Beatrice dropped the heavy microphone onto the stage floor and watched her glamorous fake world completely shatter into a million irreparable pieces. The grand ballroom descended into absolute chaos after the contents of the tiny silk boxes were fully revealed to the elite members of high society. Beatrice collapsed onto the wooden stage, weeping uncontrollably, as the wealthy politicians and influential socialites stampeded toward the exit doors, leaving her and Brielle surrounded by cold, greasy fast food and terrifying federal documents. The women of the Vance family were publicly drowning in their own irreversible humiliation, but while they were suffering the consequences of their greed, Calvin was busy plotting his ultimate escape from justice. He had just been discharged from the hospital intensive care unit and was recovering in the massive master suite of the family mansion. Calvin knew the walls were rapidly closing in around him. The church bank accounts were completely frozen by the government, and his arrogant son-in-law was currently facing decades in a federal penitentiary. He realized his only chance at maintaining his freedom was to completely cut ties with his entire family and play the ultimate victim card for the hungry media. Calvin organized a massive emergency press conference on the sprawling front lawn of the Vance estate. He invited every single local news station and several national religious broadcasting networks, promising them an exclusive statement regarding the megachurch financial scandal. He arranged for a sleek wooden podium to be set up right in front of the massive wrought iron gates of his property, ensuring the cameras would capture the sheer scale of his supposed suffering. He even made sure his private medical nurses wheeled him out to the microphones in a heavy hospital wheelchair, with a completely unnecessary plastic oxygen tube taped beneath his nose to maximize the public's sympathy. He wore a faded, oversized gray cardigan instead of his usual custom-tailored suits to make his frame look as frail and pitiful as possible. The television cameras rolled, and the red broadcasting lights blinked to life across the manicured lawn. Calvin gripped the edges of the wooden podium with violently trembling hands, putting on a masterful theatrical performance for the millions of viewers watching from home. He looked directly into the camera lenses with tear-filled eyes and began to weave a spectacular web of elaborate lies. He told the entire world that he was a completely innocent man who had been ruthlessly targeted by his own flesh and blood. He claimed that his wicked wife Beatrice and his greedy daughter Brielle had conspired against him in the dark. He openly wept as he described the sheer horror of waking up in a hospital bed, only to learn that the woman he had loved and trusted for decades had been methodically poisoning his daily meals with lethal arsenic just to steal the church building funds. He threw his entire family under the bus without a single ounce of hesitation, declaring that he had been entirely blind to their demonic corruption and financial fraud. I sat comfortably in my downtown luxury penthouse watching his live broadcast on my massive flat-screen television. My private technology team was sitting around my long marble dining room table, surrounded by high-powered laptops and heavy server towers. They had already established a highly secure backdoor connection to the live television feed currently being broadcast to millions of devoted church followers across the country. I took a slow sip of my wine and gave my lead engineer a silent nod. They immediately executed the final devastating phase of my carefully orchestrated plan. Down at the family mansion, Calvin was just reaching the emotional climax of his televised speech. He was begging the public for their continued prayers and their generous financial donations to help him rebuild his shattered life and his holy congregation. Suddenly, the main audio feed on every single news network cut out completely. The reporters standing on the lush green lawn looked around in absolute confusion as their professional earpieces went dead. A loud, sharp static sound echoed through the massive speakers set up around the press conference podium. Then a new voice began to play loudly over the live broadcast. It was the unmistakable voice of Calvin Vance. But it was not the frail weeping pastor currently standing at the podium. It was a crystal-clear audio recording of a private phone call Calvin had made from his secured church office exactly 2 months ago. The digital audio echoed across the manicured lawn and was transmitted directly into the living rooms of millions of shocked viewers. In the hidden recording, Calvin was speaking frantically to a notorious underground casino boss based out of Macau. The private conversation exposed the absolute darkest secret of the great megachurch pastor. He did not just owe a few $1,000s, he owed $12 million in severe gambling debts. He had been quietly siphoning the church charity donations to fund a massive secret gambling addiction for over a decade, and the dangerous casino cartels were finally demanding their immediate payment. The large crowd of journalists gasped in sheer horror as the clear recording continued to play over the speakers. The deep voice of the casino boss threatened the life of Calvin and demanded an immediate wire transfer to clear the massive international debt. Then Calvin revealed his twisted, psychotic master plan to the ruthless debt collector. He told the casino boss that he already knew his wife Beatrice was slipping deadly arsenic into his daily vitamin shakes. He fully admitted that he was willingly consuming the dangerous poison in small, calculated doses to build a highly documented and verified medical record. He was intentionally staging his own attempted murder to trigger a massive $50 million life insurance policy payout. He proudly detailed how he planned to use the enormous insurance money to pay off the dangerous offshore casino debts and disappear to a tropical sanctuary, leaving his greedy wife to take the absolute fall for his premeditated murder. The face of Calvin turned chalk white as his own recorded voice echoed across the front lawn, completely exposing his psychotic insurance fraud scheme to the entire world. The reporters instantly began shouting frantic questions and shoving their heavy microphones toward his face. The fragile poisoned victim act vanished in a fraction of a second. He ripped the fake plastic oxygen tube from his face and jumped out of the medical wheelchair with terrifying speed. He violently shoved a cameraman out of his way and sprinted toward the side of the massive mansion where his heavily armored luxury black SUV was parked in the circular driveway. He did not realize that the Federal Bureau of Investigation had been quietly watching the live broadcast from their unmarked vehicles parked just down the street. As Calvin reached for the chrome door handle of his massive SUV, a fleet of black government vehicles swarmed the estate. Sirens blared loudly as dozens of armed federal agents poured out of the vehicles and sprinted across the perfectly manicured grass to cut off his only escape route. Calvin threw open the driver's side door and leaped desperately into the heavy armored vehicle. He slammed the heavy door, locked the deadbolts, and jammed his shaking finger onto the push to start ignition button. The powerful engine roared to life, vibrating the entire driveway. He threw the heavy vehicle into drive, preparing to smash through his own wrought iron gates to escape the rapidly approaching federal agents. Up in my quiet penthouse, my lead tech engineer smiled and tapped a single command button on his illuminated keyboard. The luxury SUV was fully equipped with a modern smart computer system that my team had quietly infiltrated and reprogrammed hours ago. Down in the mansion driveway, the heavy armored vehicle lunged forward for exactly 1 second before the entire digital dashboard flashed bright red. The massive engine let out a loud mechanical groan and died, completely cutting off all power to the transmission. The electronic doors permanently locked themselves from the inside, trapping the great megachurch pastor in his own glass and steel cage. Calvin slammed his fists aggressively against the leather steering wheel, screaming in sheer, absolute panic as the armed federal agents surrounded the dead vehicle, ending his reign of terror once and for all. The massive glass and steel doors of the federal transport van slammed shut, taking the great megachurch pastor away forever. The following morning, the Federal Banking Commission officially moved in to seize every single remaining asset connected to the Vance family name. A team of stone-faced government auditors carrying heavy metal lockboxes marched up the sweeping driveway of the family mansion. They bypassed the sprawling front lawn where Calvin had delivered his pathetic fake speech just 24 hours prior. Beatrice and Brielle were still hiding inside the massive house, desperately pretending their entire world was not currently collapsing around them. The lead federal agent banged heavily on the solid oak front door, holding a stack of bright red foreclosure and seizure notices. The bank had officially locked the family out of their own sprawling estate, effective immediately. Beatrice shrieked in absolute terror when the armed agents breached the grand marble foyer. They gave her exactly 15 minutes to gather her personal belongings before the entire property was permanently sealed and locked down by the federal government. My mother did not grab family photo albums or sentimental heirlooms. She sprinted frantically up the sweeping staircase to her massive custom-built walk-in closet and began violently shoving her incredibly expensive designer dresses into thick, heavy black plastic trash bags. Brielle followed her lead, weeping hysterically as she stuffed her custom leather handbags and diamond-encrusted shoes into matching garbage bags. They were both hyperventilating and screaming at the stone-faced federal agents who simply stood there checking their heavy watches and pointing toward the front door. The agents physically escorted the two furious women out of the mansion and locked the heavy front doors behind them. They stood stranded on the edge of their own circular driveway, surrounded by black plastic trash bags, looking like absolute fools in front of their wealthy neighbors who were watching quietly from their own manicured lawns. Brielle sobbed loudly, asking her mother where they were supposed to go now that their bank accounts were completely frozen and their credit cards were permanently declined. Beatrice wiped her mascara-stained face and narrowed her furious eyes. She confidently declared that they were going to march straight downtown and demand to move into my immaculate luxury penthouse. She truly believed she could simply force her way into my home and demand that I financially support her ruined lifestyle. The two ruined women dragged their heavy black trash bags across the hot pavement and managed to hail a desperate rideshare to the downtown financial district. They marched straight through the sliding glass doors of my luxury building, completely ignoring the strict front desk protocols. Beatrice began screaming at the building concierge, demanding immediate access to the private elevator that led directly to my penthouse floor. I was sitting comfortably on my plush living room sofa, watching their entire pathetic meltdown unfold in crisp high definition on my private security monitors. Beatrice kicked a heavy trash bag against the polished desk and threatened to ruin the poor concierge's life if he did not hand over a master keycard immediately. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water and pressed the intercom button connecting me directly to my personal security team, waiting in the lower lobby. I gave them extremely clear and concise instructions regarding the two hysterical women screaming at the front desk. Within seconds, 4 massive security guards, dressed in crisp black suits, descended upon Beatrice and Brielle. My mother tried to slap one of the guards across the face, screaming that she was my mother and had a legal right to live in my home. The security team did not even flinch. They grabbed the two women by their expensive tailored blazers and physically dragged them backward through the grand lobby. The guards tossed the heavy black trash bags out onto the hot concrete sidewalk and then physically threw Beatrice and Brielle right out the front doors, locking them completely out of the building. Beatrice hit the hot pavement hard, completely scraping her knees and tearing her expensive silk dress. She sat on the dirty downtown sidewalk surrounded by bags of clothes and completely lost her remaining grip on reality. The deep psychotic denial fully took over her mind. She refused to walk away and hide in shame. Instead, she dragged her garbage bags directly into the heart of the wealthy Buckhead shopping district. She went into a cheap sporting goods store and spent the very last of her cash on a bright orange nylon camping tent. She marched right back out onto the pristine sidewalk directly in front of the most exclusive designer boutiques in the city and physically pitched the cheap orange tent on the concrete. Beatrice then pulled out her cell phone and began dialing every single local news station and tabloid reporter in the greater Atlanta area. She played the ultimate victim card, sobbing dramatically to the eager reporters about how she was a destitute, abused mother who had been ruthlessly thrown out onto the literal street by her evil, greedy billionaire daughter. She claimed I had stolen her home and left her to starve on the concrete while I lived in absolute luxury just a few miles away. The news stations absolutely devoured the dramatic story. Within an hour, 3 massive news vans pulled up to the sidewalk and parked illegally, just to get the first exclusive live interview with the fallen megachurch wife sitting in a cheap camping tent. A prominent local news anchor with perfectly sprayed blonde hair rushed over to the orange tent with a heavy microphone and a trailing cameraman. The bright broadcasting light snapped on, casting a harsh glow over Beatrice's tear-stained, dirty face. The anchor looked deeply into the camera lens and announced to the entire city that they were broadcasting live from the streets of Buckhead with the tragic, homeless mother of a cruel corporate billionaire. Beatrice immediately began wailing loudly, for the cameras wiping fake tears from her eyes and preparing to deliver a massive speech about my supposed ultimate betrayal. The news anchor opened her mouth to ask the first sympathetic question, but she suddenly froze completely still. She reached up and pressed 2 fingers hard against her professional earpiece, listening intently to a frantic voice screaming from the control room. The anchor blinked rapidly, and her sympathetic expression instantly hardened into pure journalistic shock. She lowered the microphone slightly and stared directly at my mother, who was still putting on her pathetic crying act. The anchor cleared her throat loudly, cutting off my mother's fake sobs. She stared right into Beatrice's horrified eyes and spoke with absolute brutal clarity. "Mom, we just received breaking news from our production team regarding a leaked digital audio recording. The recording clearly captures you freely admitting that you deeply wished you had left Gabrielle to die in a dirty dumpster at birth. Would you care to comment on that directly to the viewers currently watching at home?" The news anchor stood completely frozen on the hot Buckhead sidewalk, staring down at Beatrice, who was still sitting inside her cheap orange camping tent. Beatrice wiped away her fake tears and looked up at the television camera, expecting a wave of absolute public sympathy to wash over her. Instead, the anchor repeated the horrifying question, asking her to explain the leaked audio where she admitted she wished she had left me to die in a dirty dumpster at birth. Beatrice's jaw dropped wide open in pure terror as she realized her most vile and toxic secret was currently being broadcast live to millions of viewers across the entire country. The clip of her evil admission spread across every single social media platform within a matter of minutes, catching fire and going completely viral. The public backlash was absolute and entirely merciless. The entire city of Atlanta watched the true wicked nature of the megachurch pastor wife finally brought into the blazing light. The prominent Black community, which had once revered the Vance family as absolute religious royalty, now completely shut them out forever. Their names became entirely synonymous with pure toxic evil greed and profound hypocrisy. Local business owners instructed their security guards to refuse them service, and former devoted church members openly spat on the concrete when walking past their pathetic street encampment. The ultimate social death blow arrived the very next morning by a specialized legal courier wearing a crisp uniform. Beatrice had built her entire fake identity around her membership in a highly prestigious elite Black sorority, using their sacred letters to manipulate her way into exclusive charity boards and wealthy political circles. The courier handed her a heavy certified envelope right there on the dirty sidewalk, surrounded by her trash bags of designer clothes. The national headquarters of the sorority officially and publicly stripped Beatrice of her letters. They revoked her membership, permanently demanding she return all organizational property and completely erased her name from their historical registries. For a woman whose entire existence revolved around elite social status and wealthy affiliations, being publicly excommunicated by her prestigious sisters was a fate far worse than losing her sprawling mansion or facing a federal prison sentence. She dropped the heavy legal papers onto the concrete and let out a guttural sound of pure spiritual defeat, realizing she was now completely a nobody. Brielle sat on a stolen designer suitcase, watching her mother unravel into a state of total psychotic despair. The heavy, crushing reality of her $3 million tax lien and her completely ruined reputation finally broke her fragile mind. Driven absolutely mad by the relentless public humiliation and the total loss of her wealthy lifestyle, Brielle suddenly snapped. She stood up in the middle of the crowded high-end shopping district and turned her blazing fury directly onto her mother. Brielle began screaming at the top of her lungs, her voice echoing violently off the glass windows of the luxury boutiques surrounding them. She violently blamed Beatrice for forcing her to fake her entire miserable life. She screamed that her mother pushed her to marry a federal criminal just for the shallow optics of high society, and forced her into massive unpayable debt just to maintain a fake illusion of perfection for the cameras. She cried that she was completely ruined forever because she had spent her entire life trying to be the perfect golden child for a monster. Beatrice snapped back instantly, calling her precious golden daughter a weak, ungrateful disappointment who could not even keep a man from starting a secret second family in Miami. The vicious verbal argument instantly turned violently physical right there on the hot pavement. Brielle lunged forward with her hands outstretched and grabbed a huge fistful of her mother's expensive highlighted hair. They crashed hard onto the dirty concrete, ripping at each other's ruined designer clothes and screaming with absolute feral rage. The mother and golden child rolled around on the Buckhead sidewalk, scratching and clawing like wild animals, completely stripped of their fake Southern grace. Tourists and local news cameras rushed over to capture every single humiliating second of the vicious physical fight. They tore each other apart for the entire world to see, proving once and for all that their perfectly curated family image was nothing but a rotten, toxic lie. While the two ruined women were busy destroying each other in the streets of Atlanta, Preston was desperately executing his own cowardly plan to escape federal prison. He knew the government agents were currently building an ironclad case against him for massive financial fraud, identity theft, and federal tax evasion. He used the very last of his hidden cash reserves to purchase a highly illegal fake passport from a dangerous criminal contact operating in the shadows of the city. He packed a single dark canvas duffel bag, abandoning his multiple wives, his innocent secret child, and his completely ruined reputation without a second thought. he ordered a discreet ride to Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport, planning to board a one-way flight to Mexico and disappear into the wind forever. He walked through the sliding glass doors of the international terminal, wearing a dark baseball cap and heavy sunglasses, sweating profusely under the bright fluorescent airport lights as he constantly checked over his shoulder for federal agents. Preston approached the federal security checkpoint, believing he had actually managed to outsmart the entire United States government. He handed his expensive fake passport to the Transportation Security Administration officer and held his breath, waiting for clearance to leave the country. The officer scanned the document, and the entire computer terminal immediately flashed a bright warning red. Before Preston could even attempt to pull his bag back and run, heavily armed federal agents swarmed the security line from every single direction. They tackled the former megachurch golden boy, throwing him face down against the cold, hard terminal floor and snapping heavy steel cuffs around his wrists. Preston screamed into the floor, demanding to know how they managed to track his secret movements so quickly. He had absolutely no idea that the furious blonde wife from Miami had quietly unzipped his canvas duffel bag during their massive confrontation at my penthouse. She had slipped a tiny military-grade GPS tracking device deep inside the lining of his bag, syncing the live location data directly to my private security team. I had personally forwarded his exact coordinates to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, watching his pathetic attempt at escaping justice end before it even began. The heavily armed federal agents dragged Preston out of Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport in front of hundreds of shocked travelers while he screamed about his rights and demanded to call his lawyer. His pathetic attempt to flee to Mexico using a fake passport was the final nail in his coffin, completely guaranteeing that he would be denied any kind of bail by the federal magistrate. The Miami wife had successfully ruined his escape, and my security team ensured the authorities had everything they needed to lock him away in a cold concrete cell. Months passed in a slow, grueling blur of federal indictments, massive asset seizures, and endless national news cycles, analyzing the spectacular and humiliating downfall of the great Vance family empire. The sheer scale of their financial crimes shocked even the most seasoned government prosecutors. They had stolen millions from the church congregation, funneled charity donations into offshore accounts to cover massive gambling debts, and attempted to stage a murder for insurance fraud. The banking commission stripped them of every single luxury they had ever known, leaving them with absolutely nothing but the impending reality of wearing matching orange jumpsuits. The day the trial of the century finally began, the massive federal courthouse in downtown Atlanta was entirely surrounded by a sea of news vans, eager reporters, and furious former church members demanding ultimate justice. I sat quietly in a private waiting room down the long marble hall from the main courtroom, flanked by my personal security team and my brilliant corporate lawyers. My father, Calvin, my mother, Beatrice, and my former brother-in-law, Preston, were all facing decades in a federal penitentiary. Brielle had somehow managed to avoid direct federal indictments by turning state's evidence and completely throwing her mother and husband under the bus after their vicious street fight. But she was completely ruined financially and socially. The three remaining defendants sat together at the long wooden table in the courtroom, looking absolutely terrified and completely stripped of their former glory. Calvin wore a cheap, ill-fitting gray suit instead of his usual custom-tailored Italian silk. Beatrice sat rigidly with her hair pulled back into a severe tight bun, looking pale and gaunt, without her expensive daily beauty treatments. Preston just stared down at the polished wooden table, sweating profusely and trembling uncontrollably as the reality of his ruined life finally crushed him. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom swung open, and the bailiff called my name, echoing loudly down the long marble hallway. I walked into the packed courtroom wearing a sharp-tailored black suit, projecting absolute calm and unshakable confidence. The gallery was completely packed to the absolute brim with breathless journalists, and fascinated spectators who leaned forward in their heavy wooden benches as I made my way down the center aisle. The room was suffocatingly quiet. I walked right past the defense table without even giving my terrified parents a single passing glance. I stepped up into the wooden witness box, raised my right hand, and swore to tell the complete truth to the court. The tension in the massive room was thick and electric. The lead defense attorney stood up from his chair and slowly walked toward the witness box. He was an incredibly expensive and notoriously ruthless lawyer, hired with the very last hidden funds the family could scrape together from forgotten accounts. He adjusted his silk tie and looked at me with a sickeningly arrogant smirk, preparing to absolutely destroy my character in front of the federal judge and the captivated jury. The slick defense attorney began his aggressive interrogation by painting a completely fabricated picture of my childhood. He paced back and forth across the polished floor, his expensive leather shoes echoing loudly as he addressed the silent jury box. He spun a ridiculous narrative about how my loving and devoted Christian parents had tried everything in their power to raise a good daughter, but were constantly met with rebellion. He loudly proclaimed to the court that I was nothing but a bitter, vengeful college dropout who had always been insanely jealous of her perfect, beautiful sister. He twisted every single piece of my personal history, claiming that I was a deeply disturbed black sheep who hated her holy family because they possessed the spiritual grace and high social standing that I supposedly lacked. He accused me of harboring a dark, burning resentment for decades, simply waiting in the shadows for the perfect moment to strike them down out of pure psychotic spite. He stepped right up to the edge of the wooden witness box, pointing an accusing finger directly at my face. He raised his voice to a dramatic, theatrical shout, demanding that I admit to the entire courtroom that I had engineered this entire massive federal takedown simply because I wanted to steal their wealth and destroy their pristine reputation. He wildly accused me of hacking into their private bank accounts, planting fake offshore routing numbers, and staging the entire casino gambling debt just to frame my innocent father. He claimed Beatrice was a loving, dedicated mother who only wanted the very best for her daughters, and that Preston was a faithful, dedicated church leader who had been ruthlessly manipulated and destroyed by my vast corporate resources. He spent nearly a full hour aggressively trying to break my composure, trying to provoke an emotional reaction, trying to make me look like an unhinged, angry child, lashing out at her benevolent parents. Calvin and Beatrice actually began to sit up straighter at the defense table, their desperate faces lighting up with a sick glimmer of hope as their expensive lawyer painted them as innocent, holy martyrs. Beatrice even managed to squeeze out a few fake tears, dabbing at her eyes with a crumpled tissue to gain sympathy from the jury box. They truly believed this aggressive theatrical performance was actually working. They thought this slick, arrogant attorney could somehow talk them out of a mountain of concrete federal evidence by simply turning me into the ultimate villain of their story. They looked at me with smug superiority, thinking they had finally backed me into a corner I could not escape. I sat perfectly still in the heavy wooden chair, keeping my hands folded neatly in my lap. I did not frown, I did not scowl, and I certainly did not lose my temper. I simply let him talk. I let him exhaust himself, pacing across the floor and shouting his ridiculous, fabricated accusations until his face was bright red and he was forced to pause to catch his breath. The entire packed courtroom held its collective breath, waiting to see how the cold, ruthless billionaire daughter would respond to such a vicious public character assassination. When the angry lawyer finally stopped shouting and stared at me, expecting me to crumble under the heavy pressure, I simply smiled. It was a calm, chilling smile that made the defense attorney instinctively take a slow step backward. I turned my head away from the sweating lawyer and looked directly up at the federal judge, sitting high behind the massive wooden bench. I reached my right hand into the inside pocket of my tailored black blazer and pulled out a sleek silver USB drive. The courtroom went dead silent as I held the small metal device up into the air so the judge, the jury, and my terrified parents could see it clearly. I spoke into the microphone with a crystal clear, steady voice that projected absolute, undeniable authority to every single corner of the massive room. Your Honor, I do not need to be jealous of these people, and I certainly did not need to frame them for anything. I placed the sleek silver drive gently onto the wooden ledge of the witness box. This drive contains the fully encrypted digital dashcam audio pulled directly from my father's own luxury vehicle from the exact night the church accounts were drained. It is a crystal clear, unedited recording of Calvin, Beatrice, and Preston meticulously planning to transfer the stolen charity funds and officially frame me for the entire church embezzlement to save themselves. The federal judge leaned forward over his massive mahogany bench, staring intently down at the sleek silver USB drive resting on the wooden ledge. He gave a sharp nod to the armed bailiff, who immediately stepped forward to retrieve the device and handed it directly to the lead prosecutor. The slick, expensive defense attorney suddenly looked incredibly pale and sick to his stomach. His arrogant smirk completely vanished from his sweating face as he realized his entire fabricated fairy tale was about to be completely obliterated in front of the world. The lead prosecutor plugged the small silver drive into his laptop and connected the audio output directly into the main courtroom speaker system. A brief moment of sharp static buzzed through the massive room before the crystal-clear voices of my deeply corrupt family echoed off the high vaulted ceilings. Everyone in the packed gallery sat frozen in absolute stunned silence as they listened to the secret dashcam recording. My father Calvin was heard whining frantically about his massive underground casino debts, complaining that the dangerous cartels were threatening his life. He explicitly demanded that they find a clean and believable fall guy to take the absolute blame for the missing church millions. The chillingly calm voice of Beatrice chimed in next, echoing through the courtroom speakers with terrifying clarity. She happily suggested that they use my name and my forged digital signatures to blindly authorize the fraudulent offshore wire transfers. My own mother laughed a wicked, cruel laugh on the digital recording, loudly declaring that I was the perfect innocent scapegoat because the conservative religious community already hated my rebellious, independent attitude. Then the eager voice of my former brother-in-law Preston joined the sinister conversation. He proudly volunteered to personally plant the fake financial documents onto my private business servers, ensuring that the Federal Banking Commission would violently target my company first. The digital audio recording clicked off, and the entire federal courtroom descended into absolute chaotic bedlam. The heavy, devastating evidence destroyed the entire defense strategy in a matter of seconds. The 12 members of the jury stared at the defense table with absolute unmasked disgust, openly shaking their heads at the sheer evil reality of the megachurch family. The slick defense attorney physically slumped down into his leather chair, dropping his expensive gold pen onto the table and rubbing his throbbing temples. He knew his highly paid legal career was completely humiliated, and his clients were entirely doomed. The crushing reality of a guaranteed federal prison sentence finally shattered the fragile alliance between the three greedy defendants. Driven absolutely mad by the terror of spending the rest of their miserable lives in a cold concrete cell, they instantly turned on each other like cornered wild animals. Calvin leaped up from his heavy wooden chair, waving his trembling hands frantically toward the judge. He began screaming at the top of his lungs that he was violently coerced into the financial scheme and that his wicked wife Beatrice was the true evil mastermind behind the entire operation. He begged the prosecution for a desperate plea deal, completely throwing the woman he had been married to for decades right under the heavy bus. Beatrice completely lost her remaining grip on sanity and shrieked back at her panicking husband. She pointed her sharp, manicured finger directly at Calvin's face and began screaming out confessions to dozens of other hidden crimes just to drag him down into the flames with her. She loudly informed the shocked federal judge about Calvin's secret real estate scams and how he had been quietly embezzling cash directly from the church orphanage fund to pay for his luxury sports cars. Preston watched his wealthy in-laws completely implode and realized he was about to take the ultimate fall. He joined the vicious shouting match, terrified of taking the blame alone. He screamed across the polished table that Beatrice had been systematically dodging federal taxes for over a decade and hiding millions of dollars in fake shell corporations across the Caribbean. They were literally screaming confessions to brand new federal crimes directly onto the official court record in a pathetic, desperate bid to save their own skins. The defense attorney tried frantically to quiet them down, begging his clients to stop talking, but they were completely blinded by pure selfish panic. The judge slammed his heavy wooden gavel repeatedly, demanding order in the court, but the vicious shouting match only grew louder. They were nothing but greedy rats turning on each other inside a rapidly sinking ship, perfectly willing to destroy their own flesh and blood to shave a few years off their impending prison sentences. Brielle had been sitting quietly in the front row of the gallery, watching her beloved Golden family completely destroy themselves on the public stage. She saw the absolute disaster unfolding and decided to make her ultimate desperate play for judicial sympathy. She bypassed the heavy wooden gate and slowly walked toward the center of the courtroom, sobbing with loud theatrical gasps. She wore a modest faded dress and kept her head bowed, playing the role of the ultimate innocent victim for the captivated jury. She approached the judge's bench, weaving a pathetic tale of woe and complete ignorance. Her trembling voice echoed through the room as she blamed her mother's toxic, relentless pressure and her husband's dominant, cruel manipulation for everything that had happened. She begged the judge for complete leniency, crying that she was just a naive, devoted daughter who simply signed whatever confusing financial documents were placed in front of her. She claimed she never understood the offshore accounts and just wanted to be a good, obedient wife. The federal judge stopped banging his gavel and simply stared down at the weeping golden child with an expression of pure, absolute disgust. He allowed her to finish her pathetic crying act before he picked up his heavy wooden gavel and brought it down against the sounding block with a single deafening crack that silenced the entire room. He leaned forward over the massive bench and spoke with a cold, booming authority. "Save your fake tears, Brielle," he stated flatly. "The federal prosecution just handed me the fully decrypted wiretap transcripts pulled directly from your personal encrypted phone. These verified documents prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that you were the actual mastermind, directing the offshore accounts the entire time, and Preston was nothing but your obedient, foolish mule." The entire courtroom erupted into a frenzy of gasps and frantic whispers as the federal judge delivered the ultimate crushing blow to Brielle. Her pristine, innocent victim act completely evaporated into thin air the second the judge mentioned the encrypted wiretap transcripts. The color drained entirely from her perfectly contoured face, leaving her looking like a terrified hollow shell of the golden child she once was. She stumbled backward, gripping the edge of the polished wooden railing, as the heavy realization set in that her own private cell phone had been her absolute undoing. Preston whipped his head around to stare at his wife, his eyes wide with a mixture of betrayal and horrific realization that the woman he married had secretly orchestrated the entire offshore banking conspiracy right behind his back, using him as nothing more than a disposable sacrificial lamb. The judge glared down at the pathetic group of criminals sitting before him, completely disgusted by their relentless greed and their absolute willingness to destroy their own flesh and blood just to save their miserable lives. He ordered the bailiffs to restore strict order in the court and announced that he had heard absolutely enough. There would be no leniency, no deals, and absolutely no mercy for a family that had spent decades exploiting the vulnerable and hiding behind a fake shield of holy righteousness. The federal judge shuffled the heavy stack of legal documents on his massive mahogany bench and looked directly at the broken family. The massive room fell so entirely silent you could hear the buzzing of the fluorescent lights humming overhead. He started with my father, Calvin. For a lifetime of orchestrated tax evasion, massive corporate fraud, and the sickening embezzlement of millions of dollars from innocent church charities, the judge handed down a harsh and unforgiving sentence of 10 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. Calvin simply closed his eyes and hung his head, his shoulders violently trembling as the reality of dying behind cold steel bars washed over his frail body. Next, the judge turned his furious gaze toward Beatrice. For her deep complicity in the massive financial crimes, her active role in the dangerous insurance fraud scheme, and her complete lack of any genuine human remorse, Beatrice was officially sentenced to 8 agonizing years in federal prison. She let out a pathetic, whimpering gasp, gripping the wooden table so hard her knuckles turned stark white. Then came the ultimate shock for the Golden Child. For acting as the primary mastermind behind the illegal offshore banking rings and deliberately orchestrating the entire network of hidden shell accounts, Brielle was sentenced to a staggering 15 years of hard time. She let out a blood-curdling shriek, collapsing into her chair, as the heavy weight of her lost youth and completely destroyed future crushed her completely. Finally, the judge looked at Preston. For his direct role in executing the fraud money laundering and attempting to flee federal jurisdiction with a forged passport, Preston was handed an absolutely devastating 20 years behind bars. The Vance family was utterly and legally annihilated in a matter of minutes, completely stripped of their wealth, their fake holy status, and their precious freedom forever. The harsh crack of this wooden gavel echoed like a gunshot, signaling the absolute end of the trial of the century. Heavily armed federal marshals immediately flooded the center of the courtroom, moving with swift military precision. The heavy, terrifying sound of cold steel chains and heavy metal handcuffs filled the silent room as the officers grabbed the 4 ruined criminals and yanked their arms roughly behind their backs. Brielle was thrashing and screaming for her mother, completely losing her mind as the marshals physically dragged her toward the heavy side doors that led directly to the holding cells. Preston just stared blankly at the floor, completely broken and dead inside, as he was shuffled away in heavy leg irons. Beatrice was the last one standing at the defense table, struggling against the tight steel cuffs biting into her wrists. Her frantic, panicked eyes darted wildly around the packed gallery until they locked directly onto me. I was standing quietly near the back of the room, wearing my pristine, tailored suit, watching the complete destruction of my abusers with absolute calm satisfaction. Beatrice desperately broke away from the marshal holding her arm and stumbled toward the wooden barrier separating the gallery from the court. She looked at me with wild, crazy eyes, her face completely stained with running mascara and sweat. "Gabrielle, please," she begged, her voice cracking with pathetic desperation. "You have the money. You have the power. You can hire the best appellate lawyers in the country to get me out of this. Please, you have to help your mother because blood is thicker than water." I stared at the pathetic, ruined woman standing before me in heavy steel handcuffs, begging for my vast wealth after spending my entire life treating me like disposable garbage. The sheer absolute audacity of her demanding my help and claiming the bond of blood after everything she had done was almost physically repulsive. I slowly walked down the center aisle of the quiet courtroom, the sound of my expensive heels echoing on the polished floor, until I stood directly across the wooden barrier from her. I looked deep into her terrified, desperate eyes and did not show a single ounce of pity or warmth. I reached into the sleek pocket of my tailored blazer and pulled out a single dull silver quarter. I reached across the heavy wooden railing and dropped the cold coin directly into the front pocket of her ruined designer dress. "Use this to call someone who cares," I said, my voice echoing with chilling, icy finality. Beatrice's mouth dropped open in pure, silent horror as the heavy realization finally struck her that she was completely and entirely alone. The marshals yanked her roughly backward by her shoulders and dragged her screaming out of the courtroom doors, ending her reign of toxic terror forever. I turned away from the heavy wooden doors and began walking toward the main exit, feeling an incredible, overwhelming sense of absolute peace washing over my entire soul. My lifelong nightmare was finally over, and I had won everything. But before I could even push open the heavy glass doors to step out into the bright Atlanta sunshine, a tall, older man in a remarkably sharp charcoal gray suit stepped directly into my path, blocking my exit. He held a heavy leather briefcase, and looked at me with an incredibly intense and focused expression. "Miss Gabrielle," he said, his deep voice carrying a tone of absolute serious authority. I paused and looked at the strange man, narrowing my eyes slightly, as my personal security detail immediately stepped up behind me, ready to intervene. "I am a high-powered estate attorney representing a very prominent private client," he continued smoothly, opening his heavy leather briefcase. "I represent the massive billionaire estate of your true biological mother, and we have been desperately searching the globe for you for 35 years. I stood completely frozen in the bright sunlit hallway of the federal courthouse, staring at the older gentleman in the charcoal suit as his heavy words echoed in my mind. He pulled a thick leather-bound folder from his briefcase and began to lay out a story so deeply sinister it made my blood run cold. He calmly explained that Beatrice and Calvin Vance were not my biological parents, and they never had been. 35 years ago, my true mother, a phenomenally wealthy heiress from a prominent Black legacy family in Chicago, had tragically passed away during my birth. Beatrice and Calvin were nothing but low-level grifters working menial cleaning jobs at that very same hospital. They had discovered the existence of my mother's massive generational trust fund and bribed a deeply corrupt hospital administrator to completely alter the birth records. They orchestrated a highly illegal and deeply secret adoption, completely wiping away my true identity so they could legally position themselves as my sole financial guardians. They literally stole me from my crib just to get their greedy hands on the massive fortune my real mother had left behind for my future. For over 3 decades, those two monsters had been quietly siphoning millions of dollars from my biological mother's estate, using my stolen generational wealth to fund their lavish lifestyle and build their entire fake megachurch empire from the ground up. The sickening realization washed over me like a cold tidal wave, completely explaining every single miserable moment of my childhood. It suddenly made perfect sense why I was always treated like a despised outsider in my own home, while the golden child Brielle was showered with absolute adoration and expensive gifts. I was never their daughter. I was simply a human bank account, a captured hostage keeping their massive financial fraud alive. They hated me because every time they looked at me, they were reminded of their own profound lack of class and their deeply criminal nature. They abused me and kept me isolated because they were utterly terrified that I would one day discover my true extraordinary heritage and strip them of their stolen power. Every designer dress Beatrice ever bought and every luxury car Calvin ever drove was paid for with my blood money. The sharp estate lawyer gently guided me and my personal security team out of the chaotic courthouse and directly into the back of a waiting black town car. We drove in complete silence to his prestigious law firm in the wealthy Buckhead district, where an entire team of senior partners was waiting for me in a massive glass-walled boardroom. They had spent years tracking the missing funds following the complex web of offshore accounts and shadow corporations that Preston and Brielle had foolishly tried to manage. The lawyers placed a towering stack of original documents onto the polished mahogany table, including my true original birth certificate. Seeing my real name written in faded ink from 35 years ago brought a heavy wave of hot tears to my eyes. I finally knew exactly who I was and exactly where I came from. I belonged to a lineage of brilliant, strong, powerful women who had built real empires with their own bare hands, not fake religious kingdoms built on theft and disgusting manipulation. The senior partners slid an incredibly expensive heavy gold fountain pen across the smooth table toward me. They explained that with a few simple signatures, I could instantly reclaim my true biological identity and legally sever all remaining ties to the Vance family forever. I picked up the heavy gold pen, feeling the cool metal against my fingers, and began to sign my name. With every single smooth stroke of black ink, I systematically and legally annihilated Calvin and Beatrice from my existence. I officially erased their names from my birth records, completely stripping them of any legal parental rights or claims they ever pretended to possess. I signed the massive transfer documents, taking absolute sole control of my rightful inheritance and instantly freezing every single stolen asset the Vance family had tried to hide. Billions of dollars in pure, untouched generational wealth legally flooded back into my private accounts, making me one of the most powerful and wealthy women in the entire country in a matter of seconds. The federal prosecutors were absolutely thrilled when my legal team handed over the massive boxes of concrete evidence proving the adoption fraud and the decades of trust fund theft. They immediately marched straight down to the holding cells and slapped Beatrice, Calvin, Brielle, and Preston with dozens of brand new federal charges, ensuring they would never see the light of day again. Beatrice completely lost her mind when the federal agents informed her that she was no longer legally my mother, and that every single penny she had ever stolen from my biological family was gone forever. Her horrific screams of pure psychotic defeat echoed loudly through the cold concrete walls of the federal detention center as she realized she was going to die alone in a tiny cage, completely forgotten and entirely penniless. A few short weeks later, the warm evening sun cast a brilliant golden glow across the sprawling city of Atlanta. I stood silently on the massive wraparound glass balcony of my newly purchased luxury penthouse, perfectly perched at the very top of the tallest residential skyscraper in the entire city. The cool evening wind gently blew through my hair as I rested my hand against the smooth glass railing, looking down at the tiny cars crawling along the busy interstate highways far below my feet. My new legal team had just sent me a brief text message confirming that the federal transfer was currently underway. I looked down at the highway and spotted a heavy white Department of Corrections bus slowly rolling down the designated lane, surrounded by dark government security vehicles. Calvin, Beatrice, Brielle, and Preston were locked securely inside that steel bus wearing heavy chains and staring out at the city they used to rule. They were heading to a maximum security federal penitentiary to begin serving their massive decades-long sentences in total disgrace. I did not feel any anger or bitterness as I watched the white bus slowly disappear into the distant evening traffic. I simply felt a profound and unbreakable sense of absolute peace. I held a delicate crystal glass of highly expensive vintage red wine in my hand, listening to the soft, elegant jazz music playing softly from the penthouse speakers behind me. I took a slow, deep sip of the rich, dark wine, letting the complex flavors settle on my tongue. I was no longer the forgotten scapegoat, no longer the abused daughter, no longer the helpless victim of their toxic narcissistic games. I had taken back my name, my fortune, and my future. I was standing at the absolute pinnacle of the world, embodying the true epitome of unbothered, untouchable Black excellence. I turned my back on the setting sun and walked slowly back into my beautiful, perfectly quiet home, finally ready to begin the rest of my magnificent life. The screen slowly fades to a quiet, peaceful black. The greatest lesson from this story is that your true worth is never defined by the toxic people who try to diminish your light and steal your joy. Sometimes the environment you were raised in is simply a heavy cage built on lies and manipulation, designed only to keep you from realizing your ultimate potential. Real power comes from recognizing your own immense value and having the absolute courage to walk away from abuse. You can always rewrite your story and reclaim your stolen identity with pure grace. Have you ever had to completely walk away from a toxic environment to finally discover your true self? Please share your story in the comments below, and do not forget to like and subscribe for more empowering stories of ultimate justice and absolute revenge.